The wind howled a mournful tune across the Texas plains, a familiar lullaby to Elias Thorne. It whipped strands of his iron-gray hair across his weathered face as he scanned the horizon. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed against the relentless glare of the late afternoon sun. The ranch, a sprawling testament to a lifetime of hard labor, lay silent save for the bleating of sheep and the distant whinny of a horse. Solitude was a cloak Elias wore as comfortably as his worn leather chaps, a consequence of choices made and losses endured. Years had passed since Sarah, his wife, had last filled these empty spaces with laughter. Her absence was a phantom limb, a constant ache he'd learned to live with but never forget. His gaze drifted to the faint smudge of dust rising in the distance, a disturbance in the otherwise immutable landscape. It was too small to be a herd, too steady to be the wind. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. Strangers were rare out here, and usually brought trouble or worse, unwanted news. He urged his sturdy mare, Bess, forward, her hooves kicking up plumes of ochre dust. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a wagon, its canvas top faded and torn, pulled by a pair of gaunt, weary horses, and standing beside it, looking utterly lost and out of place, was a young woman. She was unlike anyone Elias had ever seen out here. Her size was substantial, not merely plump, but a formidable presence that seemed to absorb the vastness of the plains around her. She wore a dress of a dark, unfashionable fabric that strained at the seams, her hair a cascade of unruly brown curls escaping a loose bun. Her face, though pale and smudged with dirt, held a certain softness, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and a desperate sort of hope. She clutched a battered carpetbag as if it were a lifeline. As Elias approached, the wagon driver, a wiry man with a suspicious glint in his eye, stopped his team. The young woman turned, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step was an effort. Her gaze met Elias's, and he saw a flicker of recognition, then a wave of something akin to shame wash over her features. "Mr. Thorne." Her voice was surprisingly gentle, a soft murmur against the wind's roar. Elias dismounted, looping Bess's reins around the wagon's tailgate. "That's me, Elias Thorne." He offered a curt nod, his gaze assessing. "And you are?" "Willow," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Willow May Davies." The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Davies. His sister, Clara. It had been nigh on 10 years since he'd last seen her face, a bitter parting fueled by pride and misunderstanding. Clara, always one for society, for appearances, for everything Elias scorned. He'd heard snippets over the years. She'd married well, lived in a grand house in a town he rarely visited. But this was not what he'd expected. "Clara's daughter?" he asked, the words rougher than he intended. Willow flinched, her shoulders slumping. "Yes, sir. She sent me." Sent her. Elias felt a chill creep up his spine, colder than any winter wind. He remembered Clara's disdain for Willow, her constant complaints about her daughter's size. She'd always spoken of Willow with a veiled cruelty, a performative pity that masked a deep-seated embarrassment. He'd never understood it, never condoned it. He'd tried to speak to Clara, to reason with her, but she'd always shut him down, her words sharp and dismissive. "She sent you," Elias repeated, the implication hanging heavy in the air. This wasn't a visit. This was an abandonment. The wagon driver cleared his throat, his impatience palpable. "That's all, then. Got my payment. You folks have a good one." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of sincerity, and turned his team, eager to be gone. Elias watched him go, then turned back to Willow. She stood alone now, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, deepening the lines of weariness on her face. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she hugged herself as if trying to hold herself together. "Come on," he said, his voice softening. He offered a hand, rough and calloused but steady. Willow hesitated for a moment, then placed her own hand in his. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin cool. He helped her into the wagon, then climbed up beside her. The wagon swayed precariously as he took the reins. "Where's your trunk?" he asked. Willow gestured vaguely towards the back. "Just this, and a few things." He followed her gaze. A single carpetbag. That was all she had. It spoke volumes of her mother's callousness. As he guided the horses towards the ranch house, A modest but sturdy structure nestled against a low mesa. Elias felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He hadn't asked for this. He certainly hadn't expected it. But Clara, in her own peculiar way, had sent him something. And Elias Thorne, a man who thought he'd closed himself off from all vulnerability, found himself looking at this young woman, this unexpected arrival, and wondering what exactly Clara had intended. A burden? A joke? Or something else entirely? The wind, for the first time that day, seemed to whisper not of loss, but of a hesitant, uncertain possibility. The ranch house, though humble, was clean and orderly. Elias had maintained it meticulously, a quiet testament to his late wife Sarah. Its scent was of wood smoke, dried herbs, and a faint lingering trace of lavender, Sarah's favorite. For Willow, arriving from the sterile, suffocating confines of her mother's townhouse, it felt like stepping into a different world, a world imbued with a quiet, almost melancholic peace. She stood just inside the doorway, the carpetbag clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes taking in the simple furnishings. A sturdy oak table dominated the main room, flanked by chairs worn smooth by years of use. A stone fireplace, its hearth swept clean, promised warmth on colder nights. A worn quilt, a patchwork of faded blues and greens, lay folded on a rocking chair. On a small shelf, a few books, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared, sat beside a framed, faded photograph. Elias's wife, Sarah. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of a gentle warmth that seemed to reach out across the years. Willow felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, perhaps a longing for a kindness she'd never known. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the way her gaze lingered on Sarah's photograph, the slight softening of her features. He'd rarely spoken of Sarah since her passing, but perhaps, he thought, it was time. This girl, Clara's daughter, was now under his roof. He owed her more than just a place to sleep. "This was my wife's home," he said, his voice low. "Sarah, she had a knack for making any place feel like a home." He paused, his gaze distant for a moment before returning to Willow. "You can set your bag down, girl. I've made up the spare room for you. It ain't much, but it's clean." Willow nodded mutely, her throat tight. She walked further into the room, her movements still hesitant, as if afraid of disturbing the quiet sanctity of the space. She placed the carpetbag on the floor beside the rocking chair, the worn fabric a stark contrast to the sturdy wood. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Elias grunted, turning towards the kitchen. Just Elias. No need for formalities out here. He disappeared into the small adjoining room, and Willow heard the clatter of pots and pans. The aroma of frying bacon soon filled the air, a scent that made her stomach rumble with a hunger she'd almost forgotten. Her mother rarely cooked, preferring the convenience of hired help, and Willow's own attempts had always been met with thinly veiled criticism. When Elias returned, he carried 2 plates laden with food. Scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, and warm, crusty bread. He placed one plate on the table in front of her, then sat opposite. He poured 2 cups of strong black coffee. Willow looked at the food, then at Elias, a wave of shyness washing over her. I'm not very hungry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Elias's gaze was steady, not unkind. "You've had a long journey. You need to eat, Willow. No one fares well on an empty stomach out here." He picked up his fork and began to eat, his movements economical and practiced. Willow watched him, then hesitantly picked up her own fork. The food was simple, but incredibly flavorful. The bacon was crisp, the eggs fluffy, the bread still warm from the hearth. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, the warmth spreading through her body. Elias ate in silence, his attention focused on his plate, but she could feel his awareness of her, a quiet, watchful presence. After they had finished, Elias pushed his plate away. "Your mother," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "She didn't say much when she sent you, just that you needed a place to stay, a change of scenery." Willow's heart sank. She knew the truth. Her mother had sent her away because she was an embarrassment, because her size was a constant source of shame for Clara, a woman obsessed with appearances. The joke her mother had made about sending her to the country bumpkin uncle she hadn't seen in years echoed in Willow's mind. She hadn't even bothered to write a letter, just a terse note to Elias and a carriage driver paid to deposit her at his doorstep. She thought I needed discipline," Willow murmured, her gaze fixed on her plate. And a change. Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd known Clara, known her vanity. He suspected there was more to it than discipline. He saw the way Willow's shoulders hunched, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to disappear. It mirrored a vulnerability he knew all too well. "Well," Elias said, his voice gruff but firm, "this is a place to stay, and there's work to be done. You'll earn your keep, Willow, that much I promise." He rose from the table. "I'll show you to your room." He led her down a short hallway to a small, sparsely furnished room. A narrow bed with a clean quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. A single window looked out onto the endless expanse of the plains. It was simple, but clean and functional. "It ain't much," Elias said again, "but it's yours. There's water in the pitcher. Supper will be at sundown." He hesitated at the door. "You all right, Willow?" Willow looked at him, at the gruff exterior that seemed to mask a flicker of genuine concern. For the first time since she'd arrived, a tiny seed of hope began to sprout within her. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice stronger now. "I think I'll be all right." As Elias left, closing the door softly behind him, Willow walked to the window. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The vastness of the landscape, which had initially felt so intimidating, now seemed peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, Willow May Davies didn't feel entirely alone. The unspoken burden of her mother's rejection still weighed on her, but in Elias Thorne's quiet acceptance, she found a fragile solace. The dawn arrived not with the gentle kiss of the sun, but with the sharp, insistent crow of a rooster, a sound so alien and jarring that Willow jolted awake in her narrow bed. The spare room, though simple, was a haven of quiet compared to the constant noise and demands of her mother's house. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. The scent of dried herbs and wood smoke still clung to the room, a comforting, earthy aroma. She swung her legs out of bed, her movements still a little stiff from the long journey. For a moment, she stood by the window, gazing out at the rolling plains, a breathtaking tapestry of greens and golds stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a stark contrast to the manicured gardens and paved streets she was accustomed to. Here, nature reigned supreme, wild and untamed. Elias was already outside when she ventured out of the house, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. He was mending a section of fence, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up as she approached, a hint of surprise in his usually stoic expression. "Mornin'," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Slept well?" "Yes, Elias, thank you," Willow replied, her voice still a little husky from sleep. "It was quiet." Elias gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "That's the country for you. Quiet can be a blessing, or a curse, depending on what you're listening for." He gestured towards the fence line. "There's work to be done, Willow. Don't want to waste a good day." Willow's heart gave a nervous flutter. She wasn't accustomed to physical labor. Her days had been filled with needlepoint, music lessons, and navigating the subtle social currents of her mother's drawing room. What can I do?" Elias surveyed her for a moment, his gaze taking in her frame. He didn't offer platitudes or make assumptions. "You can start by helping me fetch water. Then we'll see." He led her to a large wooden barrel near the house, brimming with cool, clear water. "Need to keep the horses watered and the chickens. Can you manage that?" Willow hefted one of the heavy buckets. It was surprisingly heavy, and she staggered slightly under its weight. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't step in to help. This was her test. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and managed to lift the bucket, her muscles protesting. She carried it, with slow, careful steps to a trough where a pair of horses dipped their heads gratefully. She repeated the process, the effort making her breath come in ragged gasps, but a small sense of accomplishment beginning to bloom within her. The rest of the morning was a blur of simple, unfamiliar tasks. She helped Elias gather eggs from the chicken coop, her hands trembling as she reached under the clucking hens. She weeded a small patch of hardy vegetables behind the house, the sun beating down on her back. She learned to distinguish between useful plants and weeds, a skill Elias demonstrated with patience. It was back-breaking work, far removed from anything she'd ever known, but with each completed task, a tiny sliver of self-reliance began to grow. During their midday meal, thick stew with chunks of beef and root vegetables, eaten with hardtack biscuits, Willow found herself more comfortable with Elias's quiet presence. He didn't pry, didn't ask about her mother or her past, but his occasional gruff observations about the land, the weather, the livestock, created a subtle dialogue. "That storm last week," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant clouds. "It was a good one. Brought much-needed rain. Ground was getting mighty thirsty." Willow ventured a comment. The sky was very dramatic." Elias chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Dramatic, aye, and powerful. Nature don't care much for our opinions, Willow. She just does what she's got to do." Later that afternoon, as Elias was checking on the sheep, Willow found herself drawn to the small, weathered shed that stood apart from the main house. It smelled of hay and horse liniment, and was filled with an assortment of tools, saddles, and bridles. Tucked away in a dusty corner, she found a small wooden box. Curiosity overriding her natural reticence, she opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, were several delicate silver lockets, a child's worn wooden toy horse, and a collection of dried flowers, their colors muted but still discernible. It was clearly a collection of cherished mementos. As she gently touched one of the lockets, a wave of sadness emanated from the objects. These were Sarah's things, memories. Elias found her there, his shadow falling across the open box. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze resting on the contents. Willow's heart pounded. She felt like an intruder. "Sarah's," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. She kept things, little pieces of our life together." He reached down and picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his large hands. "This was for our son. Never got to give it to him." The unspoken grief hung heavy in the air. Willow understood with a sudden sharp clarity the depth of Elias's loneliness. It wasn't just the absence of a wife, but the absence of a future he'd dreamed of. She met his gaze, and for the first time she saw not just a gruff rancher, but a man carrying a profound sorrow. "She was beautiful," Willow whispered, her gaze returning to Sarah's photograph, which she had found tucked inside the lid of the box. Elias nodded, his eyes distant. "Aye, she was. And kind. Kinder than most folk." He carefully placed the horse back in the box. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Willow. Memories can be heavy." Willow closed the box gently. "I understand," she said. She knew then that this ranch, this quiet life, held more than just hardship. It held echoes of love, loss, and a resilience that mirrored her own nascent struggles. She felt a quiet kinship with Elias, a shared understanding of carrying unspoken burdens. And in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Willow began to feel a faint stirring of belonging. The small town of Harmony Creek was more a collection of weathered buildings huddled together for protection against the vastness of the plains than a true settlement. Its single dusty main street was lined with a general store, a blacksmith's forge that occasionally belched smoke, a saloon that promised boisterous camaraderie and potent whiskey, and a small, austere church whose steeple pointed defiantly towards the heavens. It was the closest Elias Thorne came to civilization, a place he visited only when absolutely necessary. Necessity arrived in the form of dwindling supplies. The sacks of flour and beans were nearly empty, and the coffee pot, Elias's sole indulgence, was showing its rust. He needed to make a trip into town, and he decided rather unexpectedly that Willow would accompany him. "Need to go into Harmony Creek," he announced over breakfast, his voice a low rumble. "Supplies are low. You can come along if you like." Willow's eyes widened, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The town, though small, represented a world away from the quiet solitude of the ranch. It was where the judgment she'd fled resided, the whispers and stares that had made her childhood a torment. Yet, it was also where she might find a sense of normalcy, however fleeting. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice gaining a touch of eagerness. "I'd like that." The ride into town was about an hour, the wagon bumping along a rutted track that served as a road. Elias drove with his usual stoic efficiency, his gaze fixed on the horizon, while Willow found herself captivated by the unfolding scenery. Cacti, their spiky arms raised in silent greeting, dotted the landscape, interspersed with hardy scrub brush and the occasional gnarled mesquite tree. The air was dry and smelled of dust and sun-baked earth. As they approached Harmony Creek, the buildings gradually came into view, a cluster of wooden structures bleached by the sun. A few figures moved along the boardwalk, their movements slow and deliberate in the heat. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, a long, low building with a wide porch. "You stay here with the wagon for a bit," he instructed, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'll get the essentials, don't need you wandering off." Willow nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched as Elias dismounted and disappeared into the store, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. Then she found herself the reluctant center of attention. Heads turned, conversations paused. She could feel the weight of curious, assessing gazes. It was the familiar prickle of scrutiny, the unspoken judgment she'd grown to dread. She lowered her head, focusing on the rough texture of the wagon seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. A group of women, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled amusement, stood outside the dressmaker's shop across the street. Willow could practically hear their whispers, their appraisals of her size, her plain dress, her obvious displacement. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, forcing back the familiar sting of shame. Just as the discomfort threatened to overwhelm her, a voice, clear and surprisingly steady, broke the silence. "Elias Thorne, haven't seen you in these parts in a dog's age." Willow opened her eyes to see a man, broad-shouldered and with a booming laugh, emerge from the saloon. He had a friendly, weathered face and a shock of unruly red hair. He clapped Elias on the back as the rancher emerged from the store, laden with sacks and boxes. "Jedediah," Elias acknowledged, a rare hint of a smile touching his lips. "Just picking up supplies." "And who's this with you?" Jedediah's gaze, surprisingly gentle, landed on Willow. He didn't stare, didn't leer. He simply looked, his eyes conveying a simple curiosity. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second. "This is my niece, Willow, Clara's daughter." Jedediah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Clara's girl? Well, I'll be. Welcome to Harmony Creek, Willow." He offered a nod, a gesture of genuine welcome that surprised Willow. As Elias began to load the supplies into the wagon, Jedediah lingered, his presence a shield against the other curious eyes. He chatted with Elias about the weather, the recent cattle prices, the mundane concerns of the frontier. He included Willow in the conversation, asking her about her journey, his tone respectful. "Been living out on the ranch long, Willow?" he inquired. "Just a few days," she replied, her voice still quiet, but no longer trembling. "It's a quiet life out there," Jedediah observed. "But Elias here, he's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a good heart. Just ask anyone who's needed a hand." Willow looked at Elias, who remained stoically focused on securing the load. She saw the faint blush on his weathered cheeks, a subtle reaction to Jedediah's praise. It was the first time she'd heard anyone speak of Elias Thorne with such warmth, and it struck her as profoundly important. As they prepared to leave, Jedediah tipped his hat. "Anytime you folks need a warm meal or a friendly face, you know where to find me," he said, gesturing towards the saloon. "Jedediah Miller, proprietor." With a final nod, Elias guided the wagon back onto the track, leaving the hushed whispers and assessing glances of Harmony Creek behind them. Willow watched the town recede, the unease she'd felt earlier slowly dissipating. The stares had been there, yes, but they hadn't been as sharp, as suffocating as she'd feared, and Jedediah's unexpected kindness, his simple acceptance, had made all the difference. It was a small thing, perhaps, but for Willow, it was a significant crack in the wall of her isolation. She realized that even in this harsh world, there were moments of grace, glimmers of genuine human connection. Elias Thorne, the gruff, solitary rancher, had brought her to a place she feared, but in doing so he had also inadvertently offered her a shield. The spare room in Elias Thorne's ranch house was a sanctuary of sorts for Willow. It was a space where the outside world's judgment seemed to fade, where she could breathe without the constant pressure of being observed and found wanting. Yet, as the days bled into weeks, the quiet solitude began to amplify the echoes of her past, the unspoken words and lingering glances that had shaped her life. One evening, after a long day of mending fences and tending to the chickens, Willow found herself drawn to the worn rocking chair by the fireplace. Elias was outside, checking on a lame calf, his presence a comforting, steady rhythm in the background. She picked up a worn, leather-bound book from the small table, a collection of poetry, its pages brittle with age. It had belonged to Sarah. As she turned the pages, her fingers brushed against a loose sheet of paper tucked between two poems. It was a letter, written in elegant, flowing script, addressed to Elias. It was from Sarah. My dearest Elias. The days grow longer and the nights. They are filled with the quiet ache of your absence. I find myself counting the moments until your return, each sunrise a promise of your face once more. I worry about you out there, alone. The weight of the world can press down so heavily. I saw Mrs. Gable today. She was speaking of the upcoming church social, her voice dripping with gossip as always. She mentioned Clara and her unfortunate circumstances. It pains me to hear such things, Elias. Our sister seems to carry such a burden of unhappiness, and it spills over onto those around her. I fear for her daughter, such a tender spirit, forced to bear the brunt of her mother's own discontent. Please, my love, be kind to yourself, and if Clara ever seeks your counsel, remember the kindness that resides within you. It is a gift that can heal more than you know. I dream of the day we can build a home filled with laughter, not just for ourselves, but for those who need it most. Yours always, with all my love. Sarah Willow's hands trembled as she reread the letter. Sarah's words painted a vivid picture of a woman of profound empathy and quiet strength, a stark contrast to the judgmental, brittle individuals Willow had encountered most of her life. She saw how Sarah had understood Clara's unhappiness and, more importantly, had seen the pain inflicted upon Willow herself. The reference to Clara's unfortunate circumstances and her daughter being forced to bear the brunt of her mother's own discontent resonated deeply within Willow. It was a confirmation of everything she had felt, but never been able to articulate. She traced the elegant loops of Sarah's signature. Elias had loved this woman deeply. He carried her memory like a precious, fragile thing. The rocking chair, the quilt, the scent of lavender, all were testaments to Sarah's presence, her enduring influence. When Elias returned, his brow furrowed with concern over the lame calf, Willow quickly tucked the letter back into the book. She couldn't bring herself to speak of it, not yet. The intimacy of Sarah's words felt too personal, too sacred to share without an invitation. "Calf's resting easy," Elias announced, his voice rough with fatigue. He sank into a chair by the fireplace, his gaze falling on the book in Willow's lap. Sarah's poems, she loved that book. Willow nodded, her heart heavy with a shared understanding of loss. She had a beautiful way with words, Elias. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of his own sorrow reflected in his eyes. Aye, she did. He looked away, towards the fire crackling in the hearth. She saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't easy to find. Willow swallowed. She wrote about my mother and me." Elias's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with surprise. "She did?" Willow hesitated, then slowly handed him the letter. "I found it when I was looking at her books." Elias took the letter, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he unfolded it. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he reached the end, a deep sigh escaped him, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken grief. He looked at Willow, his gaze filled with a new kind of understanding. "Sarah always did see more than anyone else," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He folded the letter carefully, his gaze distant. Clara. She was always her father's daughter, tense, always worried about what folks would say, never learned to let go of pride. He looked back at Willow, his expression softened. "She sent you here, not as a joke, Willow, not entirely." Willow looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean, Elias?" "I mean," he said, his voice firming, "that Clara may be foolish and proud, but she knows me. She knows I wouldn't turn away family. And Sarah knew I needed, well, she knew I needed something. A reminder, maybe, that there's more to life than just the ghosts we carry." He met her gaze directly. "She was a good woman, Sarah, and she would have liked you, Willow. She would have seen what I see." What he saw. Willow's heart fluttered. She didn't fully understand, but Elias's words, infused with the memory of his beloved Sarah, offered a fragile sense of validation. The shadows of her past still lingered, but in the quiet glow of the fireplace, illuminated by Sarah's enduring wisdom and Elias's newfound openness, Willow felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not defined by her mother's cruelty or society's judgment. She was simply Willow, and that, Elias seemed to be saying, was enough. Life on Elias Thorne's ranch was a constant physical engagement with the land, It was a language spoken in the rustle of the wind through the tall prairie grass, the lowing of cattle, the sharp cry of a hawk circling overhead. Willow, initially a stranger to this dialect, was slowly, painstakingly learning to understand. The harsh realities of ranch work were undeniable. Her muscles ached constantly, her hands were calloused and often cut, and the sun seemed to bake her skin to a perpetual state of warmth. But with each dawn that broke over the endless plains, a subtle shift occurred within her. The overwhelming sense of helplessness that had accompanied her arrival began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. Elias, though a man of few words, was an exceptional teacher. He didn't coddle her, but he never dismissed her efforts. He would show her with patient repetition how to properly saddle a horse, the precise way to knot a rope, the subtle signs that indicated a sheep was unwell. He taught her to read the clouds, to anticipate the changing weather, to understand the rhythms of the seasons. "That sky," he'd say, pointing to a bank of dark clouds gathering on the horizon, "that ain't just rain coming, that's wind, and maybe hail. We need to get the horses in and secure anything that ain't tied down." Willow, who had once considered a sudden shower an inconvenience, now saw weather as a powerful living entity, capable of both bounty and destruction. She learned to respect its power, to anticipate its moods. One sweltering afternoon, while helping Elias move a herd of cattle to a new pasture, Willow found herself struggling to keep up. The cattle, driven by instinct and the heat, were restive, their lowing a constant, unnerving sound. Elias, his face a mask of concentration, guided them with practiced skill, his movements fluid and economical. Willow, panting and sweating, found herself lagging behind, the dust choking her. Suddenly, a young calf, spooked by a persistent fly, broke away from the herd, darting towards a dense thicket of thorny bushes. Elias shouted, but Willow was closer. Without thinking, she spurred her horse forward, her heart pounding. She didn't have Elias's skill, but she had a desperate will. She cut off the calf's escape route, her horse maneuvering with a surprising agility she hadn't known it possessed. The calf, cornered, stopped its frantic flight, its large, dark eyes wide with fear. Elias rode up, his expression a mixture of relief and surprise. He gently guided the calf back towards the bewildered herd. "Good work, Willow," he said, his voice gruff but with an underlying tone of respect. "You kept your head. That's more important than speed sometimes." Willow felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling far more satisfying than any praise she'd ever received. It wasn't just about performing a task, it was about understanding, about reacting, about becoming a part of the land's unfolding narrative. Later, as they sat by the fire that evening, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the dry desert air, Willow found herself more at ease with Elias. The silence between them was no longer an awkward void, but a comfortable companionship. "The land, it speaks, doesn't it?" Willow ventured, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "You just have to learn to listen." Elias nodded, swirling the coffee in his tin mug. "Aye, it speaks. Of endurance, of resilience, of life and death. It teaches you lessons the town folk never learn. Lessons about what truly matters." He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding a gentleness she was beginning to recognize. "You're learning to listen, Willow. Faster than I expected." Willow felt a flush creep up her neck, but it wasn't the flush of embarrassment. It was the warmth of recognition, of being seen and understood. She thought of her mother, of the superficial world she inhabited, a world that valued appearances over substance. Here on Elias Thorne's ranch, substance was everything. The strength of a horse, the hardiness of a plant, the unwavering spirit of the land itself. She realized that her own perceived flaws, her size, which had been a source of such deep shame, were less relevant here. What mattered was her ability to contribute, to learn, to endure. Elias didn't judge her by the clothes she wore or the shape of her body, but by the willingness in her heart and the strength in her hands. "I'm grateful, Elias," she said, her voice earnest, for teaching me." He offered a rare, genuine smile. "You're a quick study, Willow, and you've got a good spirit. The land needs folks with good spirits." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the dark, star-strewn sky. "It's a hard life, this, but it's an honest one, and there's a peace to be found in that honesty, a peace that the world out there seems to have forgotten." Willow looked up at the vast expanse of stars, a breathtaking spectacle of celestial diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. She had never seen so many stars. They seemed to stretch on forever, a silent, majestic testament to something far larger than herself. In their silent brilliance, she felt a sense of belonging, not just to the ranch, but to something ancient and enduring. The language of the land was speaking to her, and for the first time Willow May Davies understood. It was whispering promises of strength, of resilience, and of a future yet unwritten. The rhythm of ranch life settled into a steady beat for Willow. Mornings began before dawn, filled with chores that, while physically demanding, no longer felt insurmountable. The initial awkwardness she'd felt around Elias had gradually given way to a comfortable, if quiet, camaraderie. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. A steady hand offered when she stumbled, a nod of approval for a job well done, a shared silence by the fireplace in the evenings. One afternoon, a different sort of visitor arrived at the ranch. A young woman no older than Willow rode up on a sturdy pony, her bright calico dress a splash of color against the muted tones of the landscape. She had a cheerful, open face, framed by braids of sun-bleached hair, and her eyes, the color of cornflowers, sparkled with a genuine curiosity. "Mr. Thorne," the young woman called out, her voice clear and musical. "My pa sent me over with some eggs, said you might be needing 'em." Elias, who had been sharpening a knife near the barn, looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Sarah Jane? Come on in. Always room for more eggs." Willow, who had been helping Elias repair a broken harness, watched the newcomer with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. She hadn't encountered another young woman in weeks, and the memory of the judgmental glances in Harmony Creek still pricked at her. Sarah Jane hopped off her pony with practiced ease, her movements energetic and graceful. She carried a woven basket filled with fresh eggs, still warm from the nesting hens. As she entered the house, her gaze fell upon Willow. Instead of the assessing stare Willow had come to expect, Sarah Jane offered a wide, dazzling smile. "Well, hello there," she exclaimed, her voice warm and friendly. "You must be Willow. I'm Sarah Jane Peterson. My pa runs the ranch over yonder, past the dried creek bed." She gestured vaguely with her chin. "Haven't seen a new face out here in ages." Willow, taken aback by the unreserved warmth, managed a shy smile. "Hello, Sarah Jane. It's nice to meet you." Elias, ever the practical host, directed Sarah Jane to the kitchen table where he brewed coffee. The conversation flowed easily between the three of them. Sarah Jane, it turned out, was spirited and independent, a true daughter of the frontier. She spoke of her own chores, her father's efforts to build up their small spread, and her dreams of one day seeing the ocean. Willow found herself drawn into the conversation, her own shyness slowly melting away under Sarah Jane's infectious enthusiasm. She listened as Sarah Jane described the wildflowers that bloomed after a spring rain, the way the coyotes sang on moonlit nights, the peculiar habits of their prize rooster. "You know," Sarah Jane said, her eyes twinkling, "Pa says Elias here is the best hand with a runaway calf this side of the Pecos, though I reckon you're learning a thing or two yourself, Willow." She winked at Willow, a gesture that felt conspiratorial and kind. Willow blushed, a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I'm trying," she admitted. Elias, listening to the easy banter, watched Willow with a subtle shift in his demeanor. He saw the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the genuine laughter that escaped her lips. It was a sound he hadn't heard from her since her arrival, and it warmed him more than the afternoon sun. He recognized the budding friendship, a flicker of connection that was as vital and life-giving as the water from his well. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the plains, Sarah Jane prepared to depart. "I'll be back next month with more eggs, Mr. Thorne," she announced. "And Willow," she turned to her, "you should come visit our ranch sometime. We've got the best blackberry bushes, and my pa makes a mean blackberry pie." Willow's heart swelled. An invitation. A genuine invitation. "I'd like that very much, Sarah Jane," she replied, her voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even herself. After Sarah Jane rode off, her bright dress a disappearing splash of color against the horizon, Willow felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in weeks. Elias observed her newfound animation. "Sarah Jane's a good girl," he said, his voice gruff but with an underlying warmth. "Good heart. And her pa, Silas? He's an honest man." Willow nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "She's very energetic." Elias chuckled, a rare, soft sound. Aye, like a whirlwind. But she means well. It's good for you, Willow, to have someone your own age to talk to. Willow met his gaze, her own eyes shining. Yes, Elias, it is. That night, as she lay in her bed, the quiet of the ranch house no longer felt like a void, but like a peaceful embrace. The memory of Sarah Jane's laughter, her easy camaraderie, filled her thoughts. She had arrived at this ranch as an unwanted burden, a joke sent to a distant relative. But here, under Elias Thorne's quiet stewardship, she was finding more than just shelter. She was finding connections, small but precious, that were weaving a new tapestry of belonging. The land had taught her resilience, Elias had offered her acceptance, and now Sarah Jane had offered her friendship. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Willow May Davies felt a genuine sense of hope for what tomorrow might bring. The trip to Harmony Creek had been a necessity, a stark reminder of the world beyond the ranch's quiet borders. Willow had felt the familiar weight of scrutiny, the hushed whispers that followed her like a phantom scent. But this time, something had shifted within her. Jedediah Miller's unexpected kindness, Elias's quiet protection, and Sarah Jane's invitation had planted seeds of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. A few weeks later, Elias announced another trip to town. This time, however, it wasn't just for supplies. He needed to settle some business with the bank, a task that required him to be in Harmony Creek for the better part of the day. "You can come along if you like," Elias said, his tone matter-of-fact, "but I'll be busy. You'll need to keep yourself occupied." Willow agreed readily. She wanted to see Sarah Jane again, perhaps even venture to the Peterson Ranch, though she knew Elias would likely disapprove of such a long ride alone. More importantly, she felt a strange compulsion to face Harmony Creek again, to prove to herself that the town's judgment no longer held the same power over her. As they arrived, the familiar scene unfolded. The dusty main street, the weathered buildings, the slow-moving figures. This time, however, Willow didn't avert her gaze. She sat straighter in the wagon, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She noticed the subtle shifts in attention, the heads that turned, the conversations that momentarily hushed. But instead of shrinking, she met the gazes, her own eyes steady and unyielding. Elias took care of his business at the bank, a small squat building with iron bars on its windows. Willow watched him from across the street, his solid presence a reassuring anchor. When he emerged, he gestured towards the general store. "I'll be in here for a while," he said. "You go on, don't wander too far, and if anyone gives you trouble—" He let the sentence hang, his gaze conveying a silent promise of protection. Willow nodded. "I'll be fine, Elias." This time she didn't stay by the wagon. She stepped down onto the boardwalk, her steps deliberate. She saw the women from the dressmaker's shop, their faces a mixture of surprise and renewed curiosity. They exchanged glances, their whispers no doubt already beginning. Willow took a deep breath and walked past them, heading towards Jedediah Miller's saloon. She didn't go inside. Instead, she stood on the porch, watching the swirling dust motes dance in the sunlight. A man emerged from the saloon, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He glanced at Willow, his eyes lingering a moment too long, a leer spreading across his face. "Well now," he drawled, his voice thick with cheap whiskey. "What have we here?" "A little bird lost from her nest." Willow's heart gave a nervous lurch. This was the kind of unwanted attention she'd always dreaded. But then, Jedediah's booming voice cut through the air. "Hold on there, Jedediah," Jedediah called out, stepping onto the porch. He had a jovial smile, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. He placed a friendly hand on Jedediah's shoulder. "This is Willow, Mr. Thorne's niece. Ain't no need to be bothering her." Jedediah scowled but backed away, muttering under his breath. Jedediah then turned to Willow, his smile genuine. "Don't mind him, Willow. He's got more mouth than sense. You just exploring?" Willow managed a small smile. "Just looking around." "Well, if you're looking for a good cup of coffee, mine's the best in town," Jedediah offered. "Or if you're feeling adventurous, there's always the pie at the diner down the street." Willow hesitated. The diner. It was a place she'd never dared to enter, but the thought of coffee, of a moment of respite, was appealing. I might do that," she said. As she walked towards the diner, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her. But the sting was less potent. Jedediah's intervention, Elias's quiet presence, and Sarah Jane's friendship had created a small buffer, a shield against the harshness. Inside the diner, a plump woman with flour dusting her apron greeted her warmly. The coffee was strong and hot, the slice of apple pie incredibly sweet and comforting. As she ate, Willow overheard snippets of conversation. Talk of the weather, the price of feed, the usual small-town gossip. No one mentioned her directly, but she felt the undercurrent of curiosity. When she returned to the general store, Elias was just finishing his purchases. He looked at her, his gaze searching. "Everything all right?" "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Everything is fine." As they drove away from Harmony Creek, Willow looked back at the receding buildings. The whispers would continue, the judgment would persist, but she had faced it again, and it hadn't broken her. She had found a flicker of warmth in Jedediah's protection, a moment of simple pleasure in the diner, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was no longer solely defined by the town's perception of her. She was Willow, Elias Thorne's niece, a young woman learning to navigate the world on her own terms, with a growing resilience and a quiet strength that was beginning to shine through. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for weeks, began to darken with an unsettling speed. A low, guttural rumble echoed across the plains, a sound that Elias recognized with a grimace. A storm was coming, and not just any storm. A Texas thunderstorm capable of unleashing torrential rain, violent winds, and jagged lightning. "Willow!" Elias's voice boomed from outside, cutting through the quiet afternoon. "Get the horses into the barn! Now!" Willow didn't hesitate. She dropped the mending she was working on and hurried out of the house. The wind had picked up dramatically, whipping her hair around her face and carrying the scent of ozone. The air felt thick, heavy with an unseen energy. She found Elias already leading the horses towards the sturdy barn, their usual placid demeanor replaced by an anxious nervousness. Working together, they managed to coax the skittish animals into their stalls. Willow secured the latches, her hands working with a practiced efficiency that still surprised her. Elias then directed her to secure loose tools, close shutters, and bring in anything that could be swept away by the wind. The normally peaceful ranch was a hive of urgent activity. As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dry earth like scattered pebbles, they retreated into the house. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and groaning through the wooden beams. The world outside was rapidly disappearing into a curtain of rain and swirling dust. Elias stoked the fire in the hearth, its flames a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. He poured 2 mugs of strong coffee, handing one to Willow. They sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the tempest rage outside. The storm, so violent and powerful, was a stark reminder of the raw, untamed forces of nature that governed life on the frontier. "It's a bad one," Elias commented, his gaze fixed on the window, where rain lashed against the glass like a furious assault. Willow nodded, a sense of awe mixed with a touch of apprehension filling her. "It's powerful." "Aye," Elias agreed. "Nature reminds us who's in charge when she throws a fit like this." He took a sip of his coffee. "Best to be inside, safe and sound. These old walls have seen worse, though." As the storm intensified, the lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room with an eerie bluish light, followed almost instantly by deafening claps of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. Willow found herself instinctively moving closer to the hearth, seeking the comfort of the fire's warmth. Elias noticed her slight tremor, the way her gaze flickered towards the windows with each lightning strike. He didn't offer platitudes, but he spoke, his voice a low, steady rumble against the din. "It's just noise, Willow," he said. "Just wind and water. Ain't nothing in there that can touch us in here, we're safe." His words, simple and direct, had a calming effect. She looked at him, at his weathered face illuminated by the firelight, and saw not just a gruff rancher but a man who understood the power of nature and the importance of providing shelter. He was her shelter, in more ways than one. They talked, their voices raised slightly to be heard over the storm, about the land, about the changing seasons, about the subtle signs of life that persisted even in the harshest conditions. Willow found herself sharing observations she'd made during her time on the ranch, how the coyotes seemed to sing louder before a storm, how the desert flowers, though delicate, always found a way to bloom after the rain. Elias listened intently, nodding occasionally, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw not just a girl, but a young woman who was learning to observe, to understand, to connect with the world around her. He saw the resilience she was developing, the quiet strength that was beginning to bloom within her, much like the wildflowers she described. Hours passed. The storm, though fierce, seemed to lose some of its initial fury, settling into a steady, drumming downpour. The lightning flashes became less frequent, the thunder a more distant grumble. The world outside was still awash in rain, but the immediate threat had passed. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, a pale grey light seeping through the rain-streaked windows, the storm finally began to subside. The wind softened to a mournful sigh, and the rain reduced to a gentle patter. Elias rose from his chair. "Sun'll be out soon," he said, stretching. "Reckon we'll have some mending to do after this." "But we weathered it." Willow nodded, a sense of quiet gratitude filling her. They had weathered it. Together. The storm had been a terrifying spectacle, a raw display of nature's power. But within the sturdy walls of Elias Thorne's ranch house, she had found not only shelter from the physical tempest, but also a deeper sense of security, a quiet assurance that she was no longer alone. Elias's quiet strength, his steady presence, had been her anchor amidst the chaos. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound understanding settled within her. This place, this man, had become her refuge, her chosen home. The dust devils danced across the parched earth, mimicking the unsettled emotions swirling within Sarah. Jedediah's quiet strength was a balm, a stark contrast to the taunts and judgments she'd endured her entire life. Yet, the shadow of her past, of being sent away as a punchline, still lingered. Every act of kindness from Jedediah felt like a test, a temporary reprieve before the inevitable return to the ridicule she knew. She watched him from the porch of the small cabin, his broad back silhouetted against the setting sun as he mended a fence. The rhythmic thwack of his hammer was a steady counterpoint to the frantic beat of her own heart. He never spoke of her weight, never made a comment that could be twisted into a barb. He treated her with a respect that was both foreign and deeply desired. "You're staring, Sarah." Jedediah's voice, deep and warm, startled her. He'd approached without her noticing, his calloused hand resting gently on her arm. The contact sent a jolt through her, a mix of apprehension and a strange, budding comfort. I was just admiring your work," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "You seem to fix anything." He chuckled, a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Just trying to keep this place from falling apart, like a lot of things, I suppose." His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a shared sense of burdens carried. Is there something troubling you, Sarah?" he asked, his tone laced with genuine concern. She shook her head, looking away. How could she explain the deep-seated fear that she was still just a joke, a burden that would eventually be shed? "No, Jedediah, just thinking." He squeezed her arm lightly. "The thinking can wait. Come inside. Martha's got stew on the fire, and I reckon you could use a good meal." As she followed him into the warmth of the cabin, the scent of simmering vegetables and roasted meat filled the air. Martha, a woman whose weathered face held a kindness that mirrored Jedediah's, offered a warm smile. "Sit yourself down, dearie. Jedediah tells me you're a good hand with a needle." Sarah managed a shy smile. "I try my best." Later, as she sat by the crackling fire, stitching a torn seam on Jedediah's shirt, she found herself observing their easy camaraderie. They were a quiet couple, their affection expressed in shared glances and the unspoken rhythm of their lives. It was a world away from the boisterous, often cruel laughter of her previous life. Here, there was a peace she'd only ever dreamed of. But as Jedediah recounted a tale of a stubborn mule and a runaway wagon, a wave of unease washed over her. She saw the glint in his eye as he spoke of outsmarting the beast, the thrill of overcoming a challenge. It was a skill she lacked, a strength she hadn't yet found within herself. The whispers on the wind seemed to carry old doubts, reminding her of her perceived inadequacies, and a chill settled in her heart despite the fire's warmth. She was here, but was she truly belonging? The following days settled into a gentle routine. Sarah learned to help Martha with the chores, kneading dough until her arms ached, churning butter until the cream thickened, and tending to the small vegetable garden. Jedediah, meanwhile, spent his days on the ranch, his presence a reassuring constant. He would often return at dusk, his face etched with the day's labor, but his eyes holding a quiet contentment. Sarah found herself anticipating his return, a feeling that both thrilled and unnerved her. She caught herself watching the horizon, a hopeful ache in her chest whenever she thought she saw his familiar figure on horseback. It was a dangerous territory she was venturing into, this blooming of affection. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of worn linens, Sarah found a small leather-bound journal tucked away in a chest. Curiosity piqued, she opened it. The handwriting was Jedediah's, a strong masculine script that spoke of a man of purpose. The entries were sparse, detailing weather patterns, livestock counts, and occasional notes on planting, but then she stumbled upon a passage that made her breath catch. She arrived today. A gift, they said, a joke, but there's a flicker in her eyes, a quiet resilience. I see more than they intended. I see a soul yearning for kindness. I pray I can provide it. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, blurring the ink. He knew. He knew she'd been sent as a jest, that her very presence was a source of amusement for her family, and yet he had chosen to see something more. He had chosen to offer her a different path, a different narrative. What have you found there, Sarah? Martha's voice, soft as usual, broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. Sarah quickly closed the journal, her heart pounding. Oh, nothing, Martha. Just some old, mending patterns. Martha's smile didn't falter, but a knowing glint entered her eyes. Jedediah's journal, was it? He keeps it close. Not many have the privilege of reading it. She walked over and gently took Sarah's hand. He's a good man, Sarah, a man of few words, but his heart is as wide as this prairie. The unspoken understanding between them settled Sarah's unease. Martha knew about the journal, about Jedediah's quiet observations, and she approved. It wasn't just Jedediah who saw her worth, Martha did too. That evening, as Jedediah sat by the fire, Sarah ventured to speak about the journal. Jedediah, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I accidentally saw some of your writing today. He looked up from his mending, his expression unreadable. Oh, you knew, she whispered, her gaze fixed on her hands. About why I was sent here. Jedediah set down his needle and thread, his movements deliberate. He looked at her, his eyes soft with a compassion that disarmed her. Sarah, he said, his voice a low, steady cadence, the past is a heavy stone, but it doesn't have to sink you. I see you, not what others intended, but who you are. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing a stray tear from her cheek. And who you are, Sarah, is someone strong, someone deserving of respect and of love. The words, so simple, so profound, washed over her. The weight of expectations, the burden of judgment began to lift, not entirely, but enough to allow a fragile hope to blossom. She looked at Jedediah, truly looked at him, and saw not a rescuer, but a partner, a man who offered not pity, but a shared journey. The fear was still there, a faint tremor, but it was now intertwined with a nascent, burgeoning strength. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, was a good day's ride from the ranch. Jedediah needed supplies, and he decided Sarah should accompany him. He'd noticed her growing restlessness, the way her eyes often drifted towards the distant horizon, and he believed a change of scenery, a glimpse of the wider world, might do her good. Sarah, though apprehensive, agreed. The thought of venturing out, of facing the world beyond the quiet solitude of the ranch, was both terrifying and exhilarating. As they rode, the landscape shifted from rolling prairies to more rugged terrain, punctuated by hardy scrub brush and the occasional stoic pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and distant wood smoke. Sarah, perched on the back of Jedediah's sturdy mare, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach with every mile that brought them closer to civilization. Redemption Creek was a typical frontier town, a single main street lined with wooden buildings that housed a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and a small sheriff's office. The buildings seemed to huddle together, as if for protection against the vast emptiness of the surrounding wilderness. As they dismounted in front of the general store, a hush fell over the few townsfolk who were out and about. All eyes seemed to turn towards Sarah. She felt their stares like a physical weight, her cheeks burning. She knew what they saw, a woman of considerable size, dressed in the simple, practical clothes of a ranch hand. She imagined the whispers, the knowing glances, the cruel amusement she had tried so hard to escape. Jedediah, sensing her discomfort, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just folks looking. Nothing to fret about." His voice was low, steady, a bulwark against the tide of her anxiety. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smell of canvas, leather, and dried goods. The proprietor, a portly man with a bristly mustache, eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. As Jedediah discussed his needs, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and a new set of reins, Sarah browsed the shelves, her gaze flitting nervously over the faces of other customers. She overheard snippets of conversation, hushed and laced with judgment. "Look at her. Jedediah's taken in a burden. He's a good man, Jedediah is, but what's he thinking? Sent away, she was. Must be something wrong with her." Each word was a tiny shard, piercing her fragile composure. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to melt into the shadows. Jedediah, engrossed in his purchases, seemed oblivious, his focus entirely on the task at hand. This, she realized with a pang, was part of the problem. She was still the joke, the one people would talk about behind her back, the one Jedediah might eventually tire of. As they paid and turned to leave, a group of men loitering outside the saloon turned to watch them. One of them, a burly man with a sneer etched on his face, called out, "Well, Jedediah, brought yourself a prize, have you? Hope she don't eat you out of house and home." Laughter, coarse and mocking, followed the remark. Sarah's heart plummeted. She saw Jedediah's jaw tighten, his eyes, usually so calm, flash with a dangerous glint. He didn't respond verbally, but his posture shifted, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather of his saddlebag. Before Sarah could react, Jedediah turned, his gaze steady and unwavering, meeting the sneering man's eyes. There was no anger, no aggression, just a quiet assertion of his will. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His presence, his refusal to be intimidated, spoke volumes. The man's sneer faltered, and he looked away, muttering something under his breath. As they mounted their horses, Sarah felt a tremor run through her. The town had felt like a trial, a confirmation of her deepest fears. But Jedediah's silent defense, his quiet strength in the face of public derision, had offered a glimmer of something new. It wasn't pity he offered, but a silent promise of protection. The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one, the weight of the townsfolk's speculation still heavy, but now a flicker of defiance, inspired by Jedediah's example, began to stir within Sarah. The ride back from Redemption Creek was steeped in a quiet contemplation that Sarah found both unsettling and profoundly necessary. The townsfolk's stares and the crude remarks had pricked at the old wounds, but Jedediah's unwavering calm and his subtle, protective stance had also planted a seed of reassurance. He hadn't flinched, hadn't apologized for her presence, hadn't let the whispers dictate his actions. This quiet strength was a revelation, a stark contrast to the dismissiveness she had grown accustomed to. Back at the ranch, the familiar peace settled over Sarah like a comforting blanket. She found herself drawn to Jedediah's presence, not just for the safety it offered, but for the genuine kindness that radiated from him. She started to anticipate their shared meals, not with anxiety, but with a quiet anticipation of his easy conversation, his thoughtful questions about her day, his unvarnished observations about the ranch. One evening, while helping Martha prepare dinner, Sarah noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece. It was unlike anything else in the simple cabin, delicate and clearly made with great skill. "Jedediah made that?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with admiration. Martha smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh no, dearie. That was his mother's. She was a gifted craftswoman. Jedediah inherited some of her talent, though he prefers to work with wood on a larger scale." She paused, her gaze drifting to Jedediah, who was mending a bridle by the fire. "He keeps it there as a reminder." Of home, of her. Sarah's heart ached with a sudden empathy. She understood the ache of loss, the lingering connection to those who were no longer present. She looked at Jedediah, seeing not just the stoic rancher, but a man with a history, with tender memories. Later that night, after Martha had retired, Sarah found herself lingering by the fire with Jedediah. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but comfortable, companionable. "That little bird," Sarah began, gesturing towards the mantelpiece. "It's beautiful." Jedediah looked up from his work, his gaze following hers. A soft, almost melancholic smile touched his lips. "My mother, she could make wood sing." He picked up a piece of scrap wood and his whittling knife, his hands moving with a practiced grace. She always said that true beauty wasn't in the size or shape, but in the care and intention put into it. He paused, then added, his voice barely above a whisper, "She would have liked you, Sarah." The sincerity in his voice, the genuine warmth, struck Sarah deeply. It wasn't just a platitude. She felt the truth of it resonating within her. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not as a burden or a joke, but as an individual worthy of connection. I wish I had known her," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. Jedediah nodded, his eyes holding a distant look. She was like the sunrise, always bringing light even to the darkest corners. He turned back to his carving, his hands shaping the wood with a gentle precision. In that quiet moment, a profound sense of trust began to blossom between them. Sarah felt a shift within herself, a loosening of the tight knot of fear that had long held her captive. Jedediah was not just offering her refuge, he was offering her a place in his life, a connection to his past, and a glimpse into his heart. The journey of trust was a slow, unfolding one, but in the quiet warmth of the cabin, by the flickering firelight, Sarah felt herself taking a significant step forward. The weight of her past was still present, but the promise of a shared future, built on honesty and mutual respect, was beginning to outweigh it. The following weeks were marked by a growing sense of ease for Sarah. She found a quiet rhythm in the ranch life, her days filled with purposeful tasks that grounded her. She learned to identify different bird calls, to recognize the subtle shifts in the weather by the clouds, and to appreciate the vast, silent beauty of the prairie. Jedediah continued his work, his presence a constant, comforting anchor. However, the past was not easily silenced. One sweltering afternoon, while helping Jedediah mend a section of fence far from the cabin, a familiar ache of loneliness and inadequacy began to creep in. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the physical exertion, though rewarding, highlighted her limitations. She found herself struggling with a heavy post, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body protesting the strain. Jedediah, seeing her struggle, immediately put down his tools. "Here, you take that smaller piece over there." His tone was gentle, without a hint of impatience, but Sarah felt a familiar sting of shame. She was once again reminded of her physical differences, of how she couldn't always keep pace. As she wrestled with the lighter piece of wood, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. Her older brother, sneering as she fumbled with a simple game, his laughter echoing in the grand halls of her childhood home. "Can't even do that, can you, Sarah?" Pathetic. The memory sent a wave of heat through her, more intense than the sun's rays. Her hands began to tremble, and she dropped the wood. I can't," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Jedediah was by her side in an instant, his expression etched with concern. "Sarah, what is it?" She couldn't speak, her throat tight with unshed tears and the resurfacing shame. She felt the familiar urge to retreat, to hide, to disappear. Jedediah knelt beside her, his gaze steady. He didn't press for an explanation, but simply waited, his quiet presence a silent offering of support. After a long moment, Sarah managed to choke out, "It's just, I'm not strong enough, not like you, not like anyone." Jedediah took her trembling hand in his calloused one. It was a gesture of simple, unadorned comfort. "Strength comes in many forms, Sarah, and endurance is just as important as brute force." He looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie, then back at her. "This land isn't conquered by one grand push. It's tamed by day after day of patient work. By not giving up, even when the sun beats down and the ground is hard." He squeezed her hand gently. "And you, Sarah, you endure. You show up every day. You learn. You try. That's a different kind of strength, but it's strength nonetheless." He then pointed to the fence post she'd struggled with. "That post is heavy, yes, but we can work together. We can find a way. That's what living out here is about, helping each other when the task is too much for one alone." His words, so simple yet so profound, began to chip away at the edifice of her self-doubt. He wasn't dismissing her struggle, he was reframing it, offering a perspective that acknowledged her limitations without condemning her. He was showing her that her perceived weaknesses could be met with collaborative strength. He stood and offered her his hand. "Come, let's tackle that post together. We'll find the rhythm." Hesitantly, Sarah took his hand. As they positioned themselves, Jedediah guiding her with patient instructions, she felt a subtle shift. The weight of the post was still significant, but with Jedediah's steady presence and their combined effort, it began to move. The shame receded, replaced by a nascent sense of accomplishment. The echoes of the past still lingered, but in the shared effort under the vast indifferent sky, Sarah felt the first stirrings of a new narrative taking root, one where she wasn't defined by her struggles, but by her resilience and the connections she forged. The incident at the fence line, while initially difficult, had a surprising effect on Sarah. Jedediah's gentle reframing of strength and his willingness to work through her limitations had opened a new door of understanding. She began to see herself not as a burden to be tolerated, but as a partner who could contribute in her own way. This subtle shift in perspective emboldened her. She started to engage more actively in the ranch's operations, not just performing tasks, but offering suggestions. She noticed the way Martha meticulously organized their stores and began to help her create a more efficient system, her eye for detail proving invaluable. She also found herself spending more time with Jedediah, not just observing, but asking questions about the land, the livestock, the challenges of ranching. One afternoon, Jedediah was wrestling with a particularly stubborn calf that had injured its leg. The animal was agitated, kicking and thrashing, making it nearly impossible for Jedediah to examine and splint the injury. He was growing frustrated, his usual calm demeanor fraying at the edges. Sarah, watching from a distance, saw his struggle. She remembered a time years ago when she'd been frightened by a skittish horse and her governess had tried to force her to approach it. She had learned then that patience and a calm, soothing presence could sometimes achieve what force could not. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked slowly towards the corral, her hands held open and empty, a clear sign of non-aggression. She spoke in a soft, low tone, not directly to Jedediah, but to the distressed calf. "Easy there, little one. It's all right. We're just going to help you." The calf, though still restless, seemed to quiet slightly at the unexpected, gentle voice. It turned its head, its large brown eyes fixing on Sarah. Jedediah paused, watching her, a flicker of surprise on his face. Sarah continued to speak in soothing tones, moving slowly and deliberately. She didn't try to touch the calf, but simply offered her calm presence. Gradually, the calf's frantic movements subsided. It still trembled, but its wild panic seemed to ebb. "Careful now," Jedediah murmured, seizing the opportunity. With his movements now unhindered by the calf's violent struggles, he was able to gently examine the injured leg and expertly apply a splint. When it was over, Jedediah straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at Sarah, a look of genuine admiration in his eyes. "Well done, Sarah. That was remarkable. I'd almost given up on getting close enough." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling far more potent than any blush. It was the warmth of being useful, of contributing something valuable. "Sometimes," she said, her voice still soft, "a gentle approach is better than force." Jedediah nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You learn something new every day out here." He then looked towards the distant town. "Speaking of new things, Martha mentioned that Mrs. Gable is hosting a pie-making contest at the church social next Saturday. She's been wanting to enter for years, but she's always too busy. I was thinking, maybe you could represent us." Sarah's eyes widened. A pie-making contest. It seemed so normal, so utterly unlike anything she had ever experienced in her previous life, which had been filled with social obligations and performative displays of grace. This, however, felt different. It felt like an invitation to participate, to belong. "Me?" she asked, a tremor of excitement in her voice. "But I'm not a baker." "Martha says you have a knack for it," Jedediah replied, his gaze encouraging. "And besides, it's not just about winning. It's about being part of things, getting to know folks." He paused, then added, "It's a chance for them to see you too, Sarah, not just as, well, you know." The unspoken words hung in the air, not just as the joke. For the first time, the prospect of facing the town didn't fill Sarah with dread, but with a fragile, burgeoning sense of anticipation. It was a chance to show them and herself that she was more than her size, more than her past. It was a glimmer of community, offered not as a pity, but as a genuine invitation. The invitation to the church social, and more specifically the pie-making contest, ignited a spark within Sarah that she hadn't realized was dormant. The thought of creating something tangible, something that could be shared and enjoyed, filled her with a quiet thrill. She'd always appreciated the artistry of baking, the way simple ingredients could be transformed into something delicious and beautiful. Martha, delighted by Sarah's tentative acceptance, immediately set about gathering the necessary ingredients. She produced a worn, recipe-filled notebook that had belonged to her grandmother, its pages stained with the ghosts of countless baking endeavors. "Now, the secret to a good apple pie," Martha declared, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, "is in the apples, of course, but also in the crust. It needs to be flaky, with just a hint of sweetness." Sarah spent the next few days immersed in the art of pie making. She learned to peel apples with a steady hand, to balance the sweetness and tartness of the filling with just the right amount of cinnamon and nutmeg. The real challenge, however, was the crust. Her first few attempts were disastrous, tough, crumbly, or unevenly baked. She found herself battling the same familiar frustrations that had plagued her in other areas of her life, the nagging voice of self-doubt, whispering that she was destined to fail. "It's just not right," she lamented one afternoon, staring at a sadly misshapen pie crust. "It's too thick or too thin, it always cracks." Martha, ever patient, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Patience, dearie. Baking is like life. You don't get it perfect the first time, or the 10th time perhaps, but you keep at it. You learn from each mistake." She pointed to a small, nearly invisible scar on her thumb. "This came from a particularly stubborn pie crust many years ago. Taught me a good lesson about respecting the dough." Jedediah, while busy with his usual ranch duties, would often check in, his presence a quiet encouragement. He'd bring her a cup of strong coffee or simply lean against the doorframe, watching her work with a gentle smile. "Smells good in here, Sarah," he'd say, his voice warm. "Martha says you're becoming quite the pie artisan." One evening, as Sarah was rolling out dough, she found herself thinking about the inscription in Jedediah's journal. "I see a soul yearning for kindness." She realized that her desire to bake this pie wasn't just about proving something to the townsfolk, or even to herself. It was also about honoring the kindness that Jedediah and Martha had shown her. It was about creating something to share, a small offering of gratitude. She began to experiment, not just following recipes, but listening to the dough, feeling its texture, understanding its temperament. She discovered that a lighter touch, a more intuitive approach, yielded better results. She learned to coax the dough into submission, rather than fighting against it. On the eve of the social, Sarah presented her finished pie to Martha and Jedediah. It was an apple pie, its golden brown crust latticed with delicate strips of dough, the scent of baked apples and cinnamon filling the air. It wasn't perfectly uniform. There were a few minor imperfections, but it was beautiful. It was hers. Martha beamed. "Oh, Sarah, it's a masterpiece. Just look at that crust." Jedediah picked up the pie, his movements careful. He inhaled its aroma, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "This is more than just a pie, Sarah. This is you, putting your heart into something." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of genuine accomplishment, a feeling of belonging. The pie was more than just flour, butter, and apples. It was a testament to her resilience, a canvas on which she was beginning to paint her own story. The thought of presenting it to the town, of sharing this creation, no longer felt like a terrifying ordeal, but like a quiet, hopeful act of self-affirmation. The day of the church social dawned crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant, boundless blue. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but it was tempered by a new sense of purpose. She had poured hours of effort and a great deal of her heart into the apple pie, and it felt like a tangible representation of her journey. Martha, bustling with excitement, helped Sarah choose her best dress. A simple, serviceable blue calico that, with a bit of careful stitching, felt surprisingly elegant. She braided Sarah's hair, tucking a few wildflowers into the strands. "You look lovely, dearie," she said, her voice warm. "Remember, just be yourself, that's more than enough." Jedediah, dressed in his Sunday best, a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, offered a reassuring smile as they set off for the small clapboard church. The ride was short, and as they approached, the sounds of music and happy chatter drifted on the breeze. The churchyard was alive with activity. Families milled about, children chased each other, and tables laden with food stretched across the grass. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw the familiar faces from Redemption Creek, the ones who had stared and whispered. She felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken judgment in their eyes. Jedediah, sensing her apprehension, subtly steered them towards the pie-judging table. Martha, with a determined glint in her eye, placed Sarah's pie amongst the other entries. The judges, a trio of stern-faced elders, surveyed the offerings with solemnity. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached her pie. She watched their expressions, searching for any hint of approval or disdain. While the judging commenced, Jedediah and Martha, with practiced ease, navigated the social gathering, introducing Sarah to various people. There were introductions to farmers, the blacksmith and their wives, the storekeeper, and his talkative wife, Mrs. Gable. Each interaction was a small test, a moment of vulnerability. Some offered polite smiles, others polite nods, and a few, Sarah noticed, still held a hint of that familiar curiosity, that unspoken reservation. She found herself listening more than speaking, observing the ebb and flow of conversation, the easy camaraderie between the townsfolk. She saw couples sharing quiet jokes, neighbors discussing the harvest, the gentle rhythm of a community intertwined. It was a world she had only observed from afar, and now she was a part of it. As the afternoon wore on, a voice boomed, "And the winner of this year's pie-making contest is Sarah Jenkins." A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a ripple of applause. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at Martha, who was beaming, and then at Jedediah, whose face held a quiet pride. She walked towards the small stage, her legs feeling like lead. The applause grew louder, warmer. She accepted the blue ribbon, her hand trembling slightly. The pie, her pie, had won. Kat felt surreal. As she returned to Jedediah and Martha, Mrs. Gable, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper baking skills, approached them. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Gable said, her eyes appraising Sarah and then the pie. "That crust of yours, young lady, flaky as a summer cloud. Martha tells me you learned to bake just recently." Sarah nodded, her voice soft. "I've been learning from Martha." Mrs. Gable grunted, but there was a hint of respect in her tone. "Well, you've got a talent. A genuine talent. Next year you'll have some serious competition." She then winked at Martha. "And tell Jedediah that his choice was a good one. That pie speaks for itself." The compliment, delivered with Mrs. Gable's characteristic gruffness, was more valuable than any effusive praise. It was an acknowledgement, a small but significant crack in the wall of judgment. As Sarah looked around the social gathering, the faces no longer seemed entirely hostile. There were still curious glances, but there were also smiles, nods of recognition, and the quiet hum of a community beginning to accept her. She wasn't just the woman Jedediah brought home. She was Sarah Jenkins, the winner of the pie contest. The fabric of the community was slowly, tentatively beginning to weave her in. The church social and the unexpected victory in the pie-making contest had undeniably shifted the atmosphere in Redemption Creek. Sarah still encountered curious glances, but they were now often accompanied by a hesitant smile or a friendly nod. The gossip, while not entirely silenced, had softened, tinged with an acknowledgement of her effort and skill. The blue ribbon, proudly displayed on the mantelpiece, served as a tangible reminder of her growing acceptance. Yet, for all the external validation, Sarah's deepest transformation was occurring internally. The quiet strength she had found in collaborating with Jedediah, the sense of purpose she'd discovered in her baking, and the tentative acceptance from the community had begun to chip away at the deep-seated insecurities that had defined her for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah found herself sitting on the porch steps, watching Jedediah tend to a small group of newborn calves. He moved with a gentle expertise, his large hands surprisingly delicate, as he soothed the wobbly newborns and their anxious mothers. She found herself thinking about her past, about the cruelties she had endured, about the feeling of being fundamentally flawed. It was a stark contrast to the quiet contentment she felt now, sitting under the vast prairie sky, sharing a life with these two kind people. Jedediah finished with the calves and walked towards her, wiping his hands on his trousers. He sat down beside her, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "They're coming along well," he said, gesturing towards the calves. "This is a good time of year for new life." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It is." She then looked at him, her gaze steady and direct. "Jedediah," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you." He turned his head, His brow furrowed slightly. "For what, Sarah?" "For everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For bringing me here, for your kindness, for seeing me." She paused, gathering her courage. "For not letting them define me, for letting me define myself." Jedediah's gaze softened. He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and sincere, "you define yourself. I just gave you the space to do it." He squeezed her hand. "You're not a joke, Sarah. You never were. You're strong and you're kind and you've got a spirit as vast as this prairie. I'm grateful to have you here." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, not of sadness or shame, but of profound gratitude and a quiet joy. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, but a simple, honest acknowledgement of their shared journey, of the bond that had grown between them, built on respect and mutual understanding. He then looked towards the distant lights of Redemption Creek. "Folks are starting to see it, you know. What I saw from the beginning." Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. The journey was far from over. There would undoubtedly be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But sitting there beside Jedediah, with the quiet promise of acceptance blooming around her, Sarah knew that she was no longer adrift. She was finding her place, not by shrinking from the world, but by embracing it, by contributing her own unique strength and spirit. The ranch was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming her home, and the future, once a terrifying unknown, now held the quiet, hopeful promise of a life truly her own. The harsh glare of the morning sun did little to dispel the lingering chill in the air, a testament to the late autumn in the Wyoming territory. Ilara, now months into her life at the Double Bar Ranch, found a routine settling upon her, a rhythm as steady as the sunrise. It wasn't the life she'd ever imagined, far from the meager existence she'd endured before, but it was hers. The initial shock and humiliation of Silas's proposal, her uncle's thinly veiled amusement, and the whispers that had followed her across the plains had long since faded, replaced by the daily demands of ranch life. She'd proven herself, not through grand gestures, but through quiet persistence. The ranch hands, initially a mix of wary curiosity and outright mockery, now offered a nod of respect, a shared glance that spoke of mutual understanding. Silas, in his characteristic taciturn way, had given her space. He observed her, a silent sentinel on his vast domain, and Ilara felt his gaze not as judgment, but as a steady, unwavering presence. He had not forced himself upon her, nor had he treated her as the joke her uncle had intended. Instead, he'd offered a quiet partnership, allowing her to find her footing. She'd taken to the sprawling ranch house like a duck to water, her initial clumsiness replaced by a burgeoning competence. She'd learned to manage the household, not with the delicate touch of a lady of leisure, but with the practical efficiency of someone who understood the value of hard work. The pantry was always stocked, the linens clean, and the meals, while hearty and unpretentious, were prepared with a care that hinted at a deeper contentment. Today, however, a familiar unease stirred within her. The letters from her uncle had become fewer and farther between, each one laced with a subtle urgency. He spoke of financial troubles, of investments gone awry, and of a desperate need for Ilara's assistance. She knew what he meant. He wanted her to somehow leverage her position, her marriage, to his own gain. The thought sickened her, a potent reminder of the man who had treated her with such disdain for so long. She stood by the tall window in the main room, gazing out at the endless expanse of sagebrush and distant snow-capped peaks. The wind whipped at the curtains, a restless spirit mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Silas was out on the far range, checking on the winter herds. He'd left early with a gruff, "Keep an eye on things, Ilara," and a look that she was beginning to understand. A quiet trust. She remembered the first few weeks, the sheer terror of being so isolated, so dependent. She'd expected Silas to be a cruel master, a man who had bought her like livestock. He was a man of few words, his face etched with the harshness of the sun and wind, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow she couldn't fathom. But he had never been cruel. He'd provided for her, ensured she had warmth and food, and most importantly, he'd treated her with a basic human dignity that had been so cruelly absent from her previous life. Her uncle's latest letter lay on the polished oak table beside her, the ink smudged in places as if his haste had betrayed him. He spoke of a specific opportunity, a business venture that required a substantial sum of money, a sum he claimed only Silas, with his vast ranching empire, could provide. Ilara knew Silas's fortune was tied up in the land, in the cattle, in the very earth beneath their feet. He was not a man to throw money away on speculative ventures, especially not those orchestrated by her dubious uncle. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She was caught in the middle, a pawn in her uncle's ongoing game. But she was no longer the same vulnerable girl. The ranch had changed her. The fresh air, the physical labor, the quiet strength she'd discovered within herself, these had forged a new resilience. She was not just Silas's wife. She was a part of the double bar. The rhythmic clang of a horseshoe hitting metal drifted in from the smithy where Jed, the ranch's capable foreman, was working. Jed, a man whose gruff exterior hid a surprisingly kind heart, had been instrumental in her integration into the ranch's operations. He'd taught her the names of the tools, the proper way to mend a fence, and with a gruff patience, the names of the different breeds of cattle. He'd seen her struggles, her determination, and had offered his quiet support, a silent ally against the lingering whispers of the other hands. Ilara walked over to the table and picked up the letter again. The ornate script, so unlike her uncle's usual hurried scrawl, was a deliberate attempt to project an image of prosperity and confidence that she knew was a facade. He was desperate, and desperation, she knew from bitter experience, could make people do terrible things. She looked out at the vast empty landscape again. Silas had chosen her, not out of pity. Silas wasn't a man given to pity. He had chosen her, she suspected, because he saw something in her that others had missed. Or perhaps, as the title of her own story suggested, he had chosen her as a jest, a way to finally break free from the expectations and manipulations of men like her uncle. But whatever his initial intentions, a silent understanding had grown between them, a bond forged in shared quietude and mutual respect. She needed to talk to Silas, but he was far out on the range, and the sun was already beginning its slow descent towards the western horizon. She sighed, the sound lost in the vastness of the room. She would wait. She would gather her thoughts, and when Silas returned, she would face her uncle's demands, not as a victim, but as Silas's wife, as a woman who had found her own strength on the unforgiving yet beautiful plains of the West. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise of the wild, untamed freedom that was now hers. The rhythmic thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth announced Silas's return long before he rode into view. The sun, a molten disk of orange and red, was painting the western sky with strokes of fiery brilliance, casting long, distorted shadows across the ranch yard. Ilara stood on the porch, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on her arms despite the heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched as Silas dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, a man utterly at home in his surroundings. He was a silhouette against the dying light, broad-shouldered and stoic, his face a mask of quiet contemplation that she had come to know so well. He led his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Dusty, to the watering trough, his movements unhurried. Jed, who had been overseeing the evening chores, offered a brief nod of greeting as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of Silas's presence. The other ranch hands were already heading towards the bunkhouse, their work for the day done, their tired bodies seeking the comfort of rest and camaraderie. Silas walked towards the house, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his gaze meeting Ilara's. There was no effusive greeting, no grand display of affection. That was not their way. But in the quiet intensity of his blue eyes, Ilara saw a depth of acknowledgement, a silent question. "How was your day?" "It was quiet," Ilara replied, her voice soft yet clear. "I received another letter from my uncle." Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle tell that betrayed his carefully maintained composure. He climbed the steps, his heavy boots making a solid sound on the wooden planks. He removed his hat, running a calloused hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "What does the scoundrel want now?" he asked, his voice a low rumble devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undercurrent of something akin to weariness. Ilara gestured towards the table inside. "Come, let's sit. I'll get us some coffee." They moved into the main room, the flickering lamplight casting a warm glow that chased away the encroaching shadows. Ilara busied herself with the coffee pot, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. Silas sat at the table, his gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in the dark wood. He'd built this table, Ilara knew, with his own hands. It was a testament to his strength, his patience, his connection to the land. She poured 2 mugs, the rich aroma of roasted beans filling the air, and placed one in front of Silas. He picked it up, the warmth seeping into his hands. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Ilara's. "He's asking for money, Silas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A considerable sum. He claims it's for a new business venture, an investment that will secure our future." The last part was a direct quote, laced with the familiar insincerity. Silas let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Secure his future, you mean? Your uncle has always been a man of grand schemes and empty pockets." He looked out the window at the darkening landscape. "I've seen his kind before. They prey on those who have, who work, who build. They offer promises, and when those promises turn to dust, they look for someone else to blame or someone else to exploit. He implies that you owe him somehow," Ilara continued, her voice laced with a touch of indignation, "or that you should help him out of some sense of obligation to me. He paints a picture of me as your captive, someone who needs rescuing." Silas finally turned his full attention to her. His blue eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something unreadable. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something deeper, a recognition of a shared burden, perhaps. "He sees you as a means to an end, Ilara. Always has. He sent you here, didn't he? As a joke, a cruel little game to amuse himself and perhaps gain some leverage over me." Ilara flinched, the stark truth of his words hitting her like a physical blow. She had tried to push that memory aside, to focus on the present, on building a new life. But her uncle's words, Silas's words, brought it all rushing back. He did," she admitted, her voice cracking. "He thought you'd cast me aside, that I'd be a burden you couldn't manage." Silas took another slow sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "And yet, here you are." He paused, a long, pregnant silence stretching between them. "How you have done more for this ranch in the past few months than many men I've hired over the years. You have a strength about you, Ilara, a resilience I didn't expect." He set his mug down, his hands resting on the table. "I don't owe your uncle anything, and you, Ilara, owe him nothing more than your freedom from his machinations." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, a reassurance that she was seen, truly seen for who she was, not for what she appeared to be. But the problem of her uncle remained. "He won't stop, Silas. He'll find a way to cause trouble." Silas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll deal with him. Together." He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers for a brief grounding moment. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but one of solidarity. "This is your home now, Ilara. The double bar is your home, and your uncle will not disrupt that." The simplicity of his statement, the quiet conviction in his voice settled something within her. She looked at him, at the man who had been presented to her as a cruel joke, and saw not a trickster, but a protector. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, replaced by the steady, unwavering light of the lamp, and the quiet strength of the man sitting across from her. The night was still deep, but for the first time in a long time Ilara felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, this unconventional union was more than just a shelter from the storm. It was becoming a harbor. The following days were a tapestry of routine and quiet resolve. Ilara continued her duties around the ranch house, her movements imbued with a newfound purpose. The encounter with Silas had solidified something within her, a quiet understanding that she was no longer alone in her struggle against her uncle's insidious influence. She still felt the sting of her uncle's manipulations, the deep-seated hurt of being treated as a pawn, but now it was tempered by the unwavering support of her husband. Silas, true to his word, was a man of action, albeit quiet action. He spent hours in his study, a room Ilara rarely entered, poring over ledgers and correspondence. The scent of aged paper and pipe tobacco sometimes drifted from under the closed door, a subtle indication of his focused effort. He rarely spoke of it, but Ilara could sense the wheels turning, the meticulous planning that was Silas's hallmark. He was not one for hasty decisions or emotional outbursts. He dealt with problems with the same methodical approach he applied to managing his vast ranch, identifying the issue, assessing its scope, and implementing a strategic solution. Jed, too, seemed aware of the unspoken tension. He'd always treated Ilara with a gruff but genuine respect, but now there was an added layer of attentiveness. He'd discreetly inform her of any unusual visitors or any messages that arrived by telegraph, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of disruption. He was Silas's right hand, and by extension he had become a silent guardian of Ilara's peace. One crisp afternoon, as Ilara was overseeing the sorting of newly harvested grains in the barn, a young stable hand, a boy named Billy, approached her hesitantly. Billy was one of the newer additions to the ranch, a gangly teenager with a perpetual look of wide-eyed wonder. He'd always been a bit shy around Ilara, intimidated by her presence and the subtle aura of authority she now commanded. "Mrs. Silas," Billy stammered, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "A rider, he just dropped this off, said it was for you, didn't wait for no answer, just rode off fast like." Ilara's heart gave a peculiar lurch. A rider, unannounced, delivering a message directly to her. It could only be from one person. She took the paper from Billy, her fingers brushing his as she did. "Thank you, Billy. You can go back to your work." She waited until Billy had ambled away, his gaze still fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and awe, before she unfolded the paper. It was a telegram, the stark, block letters, a jarring contrast to her uncle's usual elegant script. Her uncle had clearly grown impatient. The message was brief and to the point, devoid of any pretense of familial affection. "Silas refuses. This is your last chance. Money required urgently. Meet me at Red Creek Crossing, Wednesday, alone. Your loaned goodwill depends on your cooperation. Uncle Henry." Red Creek Crossing. It was a desolate spot, a good day's ride from the ranch, a place known for its isolation and infrequent travelers. The mention of her loaned goodwill was a thinly veiled threat, a reminder of the precariousness of her position, or so he believed. He was trying to manipulate her, to play on her fears, to force her into a meeting where he could likely try to extract something more substantial. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, coursed through her. He was trying to use her, to expose her, to perhaps even endanger her. But he underestimated her. He underestimated Silas, and he underestimated the strength she had found within herself. She looked up at the rafters of the barn, the scent of hay and horses filling her lungs. This was precisely the kind of maneuver her uncle would employ. He was a master of coercion, of subtle threats, of exploiting any perceived weakness. But Silas had promised they would deal with him, and she trusted Silas implicitly. She smoothed the telegram flat on a nearby hay bale, her mind racing. Going to Red Creek Crossing alone was out of the question. It was exactly what her uncle wanted. He wanted to isolate her, to control the narrative, to perhaps even orchestrate some kind of staged rescue that would further entrench his position. She walked back to the house, the telegram clutched in her hand. She needed to speak with Silas. He was in his study, the door slightly ajar. She could hear the rustle of paper, the low murmur of his voice as he dictated something to a clerk she hadn't met before, a new addition to manage the paperwork that Ilara's presence seemed to have generated. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open wider. The clerk, a young man with an earnest face, looked up, startled. Silas, seated behind his large oak desk, paused his dictation, his gaze meeting hers. The usual stoic mask was present, but Ilara could detect a subtle shift, a widening of his eyes, a flicker of concern. "Silas," she said, holding up the telegram. "This arrived just now." He gestured for the clerk to leave, and the young man quickly gathered his papers and exited, closing the door softly behind him. Silas stood, walking around the desk and coming to stand before her. He took the telegram, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he unfolded it. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he let out a soft exhalation. "He's desperate," Silas stated, his voice low, "and foolish. He wants me to meet him at Red Creek Crossing, alone, on Wednesday." Ilara's voice was firm, devoid of the fear that had initially gripped her. Silas looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "And you were considering it?" "No," she said without hesitation. "I know what he's trying to do. He wants to isolate me, to control the situation." She met his gaze directly. "You said we would deal with him together." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Silas's lips. It was a rare sight, and it warmed Ilara in a way she hadn't expected. "And we will. Red Creek Crossing is a fool's errand for a lone woman. But perhaps, he mused, his eyes glinting with a hint of something mischievous, it could be a very instructive outing for two. He placed a hand on her arm, his grip firm and reassuring. Wednesday, we will go to Red Creek Crossing. But we will not be alone, Ilara. And your uncle will learn that the woman he tried to send as a joke has found a home and a protector here at the Double Bar. The quiet strength in his voice was a powerful force, a testament to the unexpected bond that was growing between them. A bond forged not in romance, but in shared resilience and a mutual disdain for the manipulations of men like her uncle. Wednesday dawned clear and cold, the Wyoming sky a vast unbroken expanse of brilliant blue. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Ilara, dressed in sturdy riding attire, felt a tremor of anticipation mixed with a healthy dose of apprehension. This was it, the confrontation her uncle had orchestrated, the culmination of his increasingly desperate attempts to exert control. Silas had been unusually taciturn that morning, his focus solely on preparing for their journey. He'd personally selected their mounts, opting for two of his fastest, most dependable horses, his own bay mare, Dusty, and a powerful grey stallion for Ilara, a horse named Storm that Jed assured her was as steady as he was swift. He'd packed a sturdy saddlebag with provisions, jerky, hardtack, a flask of potent coffee, and a well-worn Colt .45 revolver, which he'd carefully placed in Ilara's saddle holster. Just in case, he'd said, his gaze direct. Your uncle is unpredictable, and the territory is wild. Better to be prepared. Ilara had accepted the firearm with a sense of grim determination. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but the weight of it in her hand felt strangely empowering. It was another layer of protection, another tool in the arsenal Silas was providing her. Jed and the other ranch hands had watched them depart, with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Jed had given Ilara a gruff nod, his eyes conveying a silent message of support. Silas had simply given a curt wave, his focus already on the trail ahead. The ride to Red Creek Crossing was long and arduous. They rode in near silence, the rhythmic creak of leather and the steady beat of hooves the only sounds breaking the vast stillness. Ilara found herself studying Silas, observing the subtle ways he navigated the rugged terrain, his body language conveying a quiet confidence. He seemed to draw strength from the land itself, a part of its wild, untamed spirit. As they drew closer to their destination, the landscape grew more desolate. The rolling plains gave way to a more rugged terrain, characterized by dry creek beds, sparse scrub brush, and weathered rock formations. Red Creek Crossing itself was little more than a shallow ford across a slow-moving muddy creek, flanked by a few gnarled trees. It was a place that seemed to have been forgotten by time, a perfect setting for a clandestine meeting. Silas reined in Dusty, his eyes scanning the area with practiced vigilance. Ilara, astride Storm, pulled up beside him, her own gaze sweeping across the desolate landscape. There was no sign of anyone. "He's late," Silas observed, his voice low. "Or perhaps he's trying a different tactic, watching us from a distance." "He wouldn't dare," Ilara said, though a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Her uncle was a coward, but his desperation might have pushed him to bolder, more dangerous actions. "We wait," Silas stated, dismounting and tethering Dusty to a low-hanging branch. He then dismounted Ilara, his hands steady as they guided her down from Storm. His touch lingered for a moment, a silent reassurance. They sat on a weathered log near the creek, the silence amplifying the distant cries of unseen birds. Ilara felt a strange mix of emotions, anger at her uncle's audacity, a quiet confidence in Silas's presence, and a lingering fear of the unknown. Just as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the creek bed, a lone rider emerged from the dusty haze in the distance. The figure was indistinct at first, but as they drew closer, Ilara recognized the familiar, if somewhat gaudy, attire of her uncle, Henry. He rode a fine-looking horse, a clear contrast to the rugged, utilitarian steeds of the ranch hands. Henry dismounted with an exaggerated flourish, his movements betraying a nervous energy. He strode towards them, his smile a thin, unconvincing rictus. "Ilara, my dear, and Silas, I confess I was beginning to think you wouldn't come. But then, you've always been a responsible girl, Ilara." He paused, his gaze flicking to Silas, a flicker of something unpleasant, passing across his features. "And Silas, I appreciate you allowing her this outing, a moment to reconnect with family." Silas remained seated, his expression unreadable. He simply watched Henry, a predator observing his prey. "Uncle Henry," Ilara said, her voice steady. "You sent for me. You said you needed my help." "Indeed, my dear, indeed," Henry declared, stepping closer. He lowered his voice conspiratorially, though it carried clearly in the quiet air. "The venture I mentioned, it's proved more lucrative than anticipated, but I require a final infusion of capital, a significant sum, I'm afraid. Silas, I know you're a man of means. Surely you can see the benefit of a prosperous partnership." Silas finally rose, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over Henry. He walked slowly towards Ilara's uncle, his gaze never leaving his face. "Your schemes are well known, Henry," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "And your attempts to exploit Ilara are at an end," Henry scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado. "Exploit? My dear Silas, I am merely seeking to secure the future of my niece. A future, I might add, that seems rather constrained here at the Double Bar." He gestured vaguely at the barren surroundings. "A life of servitude, wouldn't you agree, Ilara?" Ilara stood a little straighter, her hand resting near the butt of the Colt in her holster. "My life is my own, Uncle Henry, and it is not for you to dictate." Henry's smile faltered. He hadn't expected such defiance. He turned his attention back to Silas, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Silas? You claim to have an interest in her. Is this how you show it? By keeping her cloistered away, a prize for your own amusement? I heard she was sent to you as a jest. Is that true?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Ilara felt a cold dread wash over her. Her uncle had deliberately chosen this vulnerable spot, this desolate place, to try and break her. Silas stepped forward, his shadow falling directly over Henry. "The jest, Henry," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet, "was your belief that you could control Ilara, or that you could manipulate me." He reached out and plucked a piece of dried grass from Henry's waistcoat. "You came here expecting me to be intimidated by your threats. You expected Ilara to be frightened, to beg for your help. But you've underestimated us both." Henry's face contorted with anger. "You think you can defy me? I have connections. I can make things very difficult for you, Silas. For both of you." Silas merely smiled, a chilling expression that held no warmth. "Connections? Here in Wyoming, connections mean little. It's strength that matters, and integrity." He glanced at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. Ilara met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She was no longer the frightened girl her uncle had tried to mold. She was Silas's wife, a part of the Double Bar. "You have no claim over me, Uncle Henry," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You never did. You saw me as a way to profit, nothing more. And now you will leave, and you will never bother me again." Henry's face turned a mottled red. He glared at Silas, then at Ilara, his eyes filled with venom. "You will regret this," he spat, turning abruptly and remounting his horse. "Both of you. You have made a grave mistake." With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the dust and heat. Silence descended once more, heavier now, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Ilara let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. Silas placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "He's gone," he said, his voice reassuring. "And he won't be back." "How can you be so sure?" Ilara asked, her voice still a little breathless. Silas looked out at the empty trail where her uncle had disappeared. "Because," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "he knows I'm not afraid of him, and you, Ilara, are no longer afraid of him either." He picked up Ilara's hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "You were brave today, very brave." In the quiet solitude of Red Creek Crossing, with the vast Wyoming sky as their witness, Ilara felt a profound sense of relief and something more. She had faced her past, her tormentor, and she had not faltered. And by her side, steady and unyielding, was Silas. The jest had indeed become something else entirely. The ride back to the Double Bar was different from the journey out. The tension of the confrontation had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph and an even deeper understanding between Ilara and Silas. The setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over the plains, painting the landscape in hues of amber and rose. The vastness that had once felt intimidating now seemed like a protective embrace. Silas, usually a man of few words, seemed more at ease, the stoic mask softening around the edges. He spoke occasionally, pointing out distant landmarks or remarking on the changing patterns of the clouds. Ilara found herself responding more freely, her earlier apprehension giving way to a relaxed conversation. "He underestimated you, Silas," Ilara said, her voice thoughtful. "He thought you were simply a wealthy rancher, easily swayed by threats." Silas gave a low chuckle. "Men like Henry underestimate a lot of things. They underestimate the value of hard work, the strength of quiet resolve, and the resilience of a spirit that has been tested." He glanced at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You stood your ground today, Ilara. You didn't flinch. You met him with the same strength he tried to deny you." "I had your support," she replied, her voice soft. "Knowing you were there made all the difference." "We are a team, Ilara," Silas said, his tone firm. "That's what this is, a partnership." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Your uncle will likely try something else. His pride is wounded, but he knows now that you are not alone and that I will not allow him to harm you or disrupt what we have built here." As they rode into the ranch yard, the lights of the house seemed to welcome them back like a beacon. Jed was waiting by the corrals, his silhouette a familiar and comforting sight. He approached Silas, a question in his eyes. "He's gone, Jed," Silas said, dismounting, "and he won't be back." Jed gave a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of Silas's authority, and a subtle expression of relief. He then turned his attention to Ilara, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Good to have you back, Mrs. Silas. Heard you handled yourself well." Ilara felt a warmth spread through her at Jed's words. To be acknowledged, to be accepted, meant more than he could ever know. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Later that evening, after a hearty supper prepared by Ilara, they sat by the fire in the main room. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere. Silas, usually so reserved, seemed more open tonight. He spoke of his childhood on the frontier, of the hardships his family had faced, and of the vision he had for the Double Bar Ranch. "My father, he built this place from nothing," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "He believed in the land, in the potential it held. I've tried to honor that legacy." He looked at Ilara, his blue eyes intense. "When I made the offer, it wasn't entirely a joke, Ilara, or perhaps it was a jest I played on myself. I saw something in you, something I couldn't articulate, a strength, a loneliness that mirrored my own in a way." Ilara listened, captivated. This was the most Silas had ever revealed of his inner thoughts and feelings. She realized that beneath his gruff exterior lay a man who had also been wounded, who had also sought solace in the vastness of the land. "I was lost, Silas," Ilara confessed, her voice soft. "My uncle had made me believe I was worthless, a burden. I expected to be treated as such." "You are not a burden, Ilara," Silas said, his voice firm. "You are my wife, and you are a vital part of this ranch. Your presence has changed things, for the better." He reached across the hearth and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "I didn't know what I was doing, not really, but I knew I didn't want him to have you, and I knew I didn't want you to be alone." The words, simple and direct, resonated deeply within Ilara. It wasn't a declaration of passionate love, not in the way of storybooks, but it was something more profound, something real. It was an acknowledgement of shared experience, of mutual need, of a quiet, growing respect that was slowly blossoming into something akin to affection, perhaps even love. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered, squeezing his hand, "for seeing me." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their faces. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet solitude of the Double Bar Ranch, Ilara felt a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer the obese daughter sent as a joke. She was Ilara, Silas's wife, and this was her home. The path ahead might still hold challenges, but she would face them, not alone, but with the quiet strength and unwavering support of the man beside her. The seeds of trust and affection, planted in the harsh soil of the frontier, were beginning to take root. The days following the confrontation at Red Creek Crossing settled into a comfortable rhythm. The threat of Ilara's uncle had receded, replaced by a newfound sense of peace and security within the sprawling confines of the Double Bar Ranch. Ilara found herself embracing her role with a growing confidence, her days filled with purpose and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. She managed the household with an efficiency that impressed even the stoic Jed, her meals hearty and wholesome, her presence a calming influence on the usually boisterous ranch hands. Silas, too, seemed to carry a lighter burden. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened, and he was often seen with a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He spent more time with Ilara, not in grand gestures, but in the shared quietude of their life. They would often sit by the fire in the evenings, Silas reading from his worn collection of books, while Ilara worked on her mending, the comfortable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. He found himself sharing more of his past, stories of his father's struggles and triumphs, and his own deep connection to the land. One afternoon, Silas found Ilara in the small, sun-drenched room she had turned into a makeshift library and study. She was carefully cataloguing a collection of old books that had belonged to Silas's father, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Finding anything interesting?" Silas asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ilara looked up, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "This one," she said, holding up a thick, leather-bound volume, "is a journal. Your father's, I presume. It's filled with observations about the land, weather patterns, even sketches of plants and animals." Silas walked over, his gaze falling on the journal. A flicker of remembrance crossed his face. "Aye, that's Pa's. He loved this land. He saw more than just acres and cattle. He saw a living, breathing entity." He gently took the journal from her, his calloused fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. "He had a deep respect for the natural world, taught me to do the same." He opened the journal, and for a moment, the silence was filled with the rustle of aged pages. Silas pointed to a particular passage, his voice soft. "See here? He writes about the rare bloom of the desert mariposa after a long drought. He describes its resilience, how it pushed through the hardened earth against all odds." He looked at Ilara, his blue eyes holding a depth of meaning. He always saw parallels between the land and the people who worked it. The strength to endure, to bloom in the harshest conditions. Ilara understood. He was drawing a parallel to her own journey, to her own resilience. The simple act of sharing his father's journal, of revealing this intimate part of his past, felt like a significant step in their burgeoning relationship. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Ilara said softly. "He was," Silas agreed. "He taught me that true wealth wasn't in gold or silver, but in the land beneath your feet and the character you built within yourself." He closed the journal and placed it carefully back on the shelf. "Your Uncle Henry has a different definition of wealth, I suspect, one that comes at the expense of others." The mention of her uncle brought a slight shadow to Ilara's face, but it was quickly dispelled. "He doesn't understand," she said, her voice firm. "He never will." "And he doesn't need to," Silas said, his gaze steady. "We have what we need here, the land, the work, and each other." He paused, a rare vulnerability in his tone. I am glad you are here, Ilara. Truly glad." The sincerity in his voice touched Ilara deeply. It wasn't a declaration of passionate love, but it was a genuine acknowledgement of her presence, of her value. It was a cornerstone upon which something real and lasting could be built. Later that week, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Double Bar. A traveling preacher, a man named Reverend Abernathy, had heard of Silas's quiet but significant presence in the territory and had made a special detour to offer his services. He was a kindly, earnest man with a booming voice and a gentle demeanor. Reverend Abernathy spent the evening with them, sharing a meal and engaging in conversation. He spoke of his travels, of the scattered communities he ministered to, and of the importance of faith and community in the rugged landscape of the West. He seemed unfazed by Ilara's sighs, his gaze always meeting hers directly, with genuine warmth and respect. As the evening drew to a close, Reverend Abernathy turned to Silas and Ilara. "It brings me great joy," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity, "to see two souls finding solace and companionship in this vast wilderness. Silas, you are a man of strong character, and Ilara, you possess a spirit that shines brightly." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "Perhaps in time you might consider making your union even more official in the eyes of the Lord and your community." Ilara and Silas exchanged glances. The thought had crossed Ilara's mind, of course. Their marriage, born of convenience and circumstance, had deepened into something far more significant. Silas, too, had clearly come to value her presence, her partnership. Silas cleared his throat, a rare sign of his discomfort with overt sentimentality. "Reverend, we appreciate your kind words. Ilara is my wife, and I am honored to be his wife," Ilara added, her voice clear and strong. Reverend Abernathy smiled, a broad, benevolent smile. Of course. A simple statement of fact. But sometimes a public affirmation can strengthen the bonds that already exist. He nodded sagely. The Lord works in mysterious ways, as we all know, and sometimes those ways involve a little more celebration. As Reverend Abernathy prepared to depart the next morning, he left Ilara and Silas with a parting thought. "The West is a harsh mistress," he said, his voice filled with wisdom. "But it is also a place where true bonds are forged, where character is tested, and where love in its many forms can find the most unexpected and beautiful ways to bloom." After the preacher's departure, Silas and Ilara stood on the porch, watching him ride away. A comfortable silence settled between them. "He's a wise man," Ilara said, breaking the silence. "He's seen a lot," Silas agreed. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Ilara, he's right, in a way. We have found something here." Ilara met his gaze, her heart beating a little faster. "Yes, Silas, we have." The conversation had been left unspoken, but the implication hung in the air, a silent promise of a future that was unfolding, not as a joke, but as a genuine testament to resilience, compassion, and the unexpected blossoming of love in the heart of the untamed West. The foundation of their unconventional union was being laid, brick by careful brick, on the solid ground of mutual respect and a shared life. The late autumn air had a crispness that hinted at the approaching winter, the days growing shorter, the sun's rays less potent. Ilara found a quiet satisfaction in preparing the ranch house for the colder months. She'd meticulously seen to the preservation of the last of the season's harvest, her hands stained with berries, and her apron dusted with flour. The pantry shelves were stocked high with jars of preserves, dried fruits, and sacks of grains, a testament to her diligence. Silas, in his characteristic way, had been preparing the ranch itself for winter. He worked alongside his men, overseeing the reinforcement of fences, the bringing in of winter feed for the cattle, and the stacking of firewood. He moved with an economy of motion, his strength and experience evident in every task. Yet he always found time to check in with Ilara, his gruff, "Everything all right?" a silent affirmation of their partnership. One evening, as they sat by the crackling fire, the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat filling the cozy confines of the main room, Silas brought up a subject that had been on his mind. "Jed mentioned some of the men are talking about heading further north," Silas said, his voice thoughtful, "looking for work in the silver mines. The winter is going to be hard and the pay, well, it's slim pickings out here on the range when the snows come." Ilara listened, her hands stilling in her lap. She understood the reality of their situation. The ranch, while vast, wasn't a bottomless well of riches. Winters could be brutal, and wages for ranch hands were not always enough to sustain a family through the lean months. "Are you concerned?" she asked. Silas stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. "Concerned? It's their choice. I can't begrudge them for seeking better opportunities. But Jed is a good man, and a few of the others, they've proven their loyalty. I'd hate to see them leave." He paused, then turned to Ilara, his blue eyes meeting hers. "You've made a difference, Ilara. Your presence here, it's settled things. The men respect you. They see you as more than just someone who married into the ranch. They see you as part of it." Ilara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the highest praise Silas could offer, a quiet acknowledgement of her contribution. "They've been good to me, Silas. They're good men." "Aye, they are," Silas agreed, "and I'd like to see them stay. But I can't ask them to sacrifice their own well-being for mine." He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of working the land. Perhaps we can find a way to keep them here, to offer them something more." Ilara considered his words. She knew Silas was a man who valued loyalty and hard work above all else. He had a deep sense of responsibility towards those who worked for him. "What do you have in mind?" she asked. Silas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I've been thinking about diversifying, not just cattle. The soil here is good. We have plenty of land. Perhaps with the spring we could start a more significant farming operation, grow more than just feed for the animals, crops for market, and with a successful harvest and we could offer them a share, a stake in the venture, not just wages. Ilara's eyes lit up. This was precisely the kind of forward-thinking approach that Silas possessed. That's a wonderful idea, Silas. A farming operation would provide steady work, even through the winter, preparing the land, tending to the crops, and a share of the profits. That would be a strong incentive for them to stay. It would require investment, Silas mused, rubbing his chin. New equipment, seeds, perhaps even hiring additional hands with farming experience. It's a risk, but a calculated risk, Ilara countered, her mind already buzzing with possibilities. We have the land, we have the resources, and we have the most important thing, your leadership and the loyalty of the men. I could oversee the household accounts, manage the supplies for the farm, ensure everything is run efficiently. She met his gaze, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. We could do this, Silas, together. Silas looked at her, a rare smile gracing his lips. He saw not just a wife, but a partner, a woman of intelligence and initiative. Together, he echoed, the word carrying a weight of unspoken promise. Aye, together. The conversation continued late into the night, their shared vision for the future of the Double Bar Ranch weaving a tapestry of dreams and possibilities. They discussed crop rotations, the types of machinery they might need, and the best way to approach the ranch hands with the proposal. Ilara, drawing on her own experiences of scarcity and hardship, felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the prospect of creating a more stable and prosperous future for everyone on the ranch, including herself. The next morning, Silas called a meeting of all the ranch hands. He stood before them, his voice clear and steady, Ilara by his side, a silent but powerful presence. He spoke of the coming winter, of the challenges it presented, and then he unveiled his plan. He spoke of diversifying, of expanding into farming, of offering not just wages but a share in the success of their endeavors. A ripple of murmurs went through the assembled men. They listened intently, their faces etched with a mixture of surprise and hope. When Silas finished, it was Jed who spoke first, his gruff voice filled with an uncharacteristic note of optimism. A farming operation, Silas. That's a big undertaking. It is, Silas admitted. But it's one I believe we can succeed at, with the right planning, hard work, and a commitment from all of us. He then turned to Ilara. My wife, Ilara, will be overseeing much of the planning and management of the farming supplies and accounts. She has a keen mind for detail, and I trust her judgment implicitly. Ilara felt a surge of pride at Silas's words. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. We will need everyone's cooperation, she said, her voice clear and strong. This is an opportunity for all of us to build something more secure, something that will benefit us all in the long run. We will face challenges, of course, but if we work together with dedication and perseverance, I have no doubt we can make this venture a resounding success. The ranch hands looked at Silas, then at Ilara, their expressions shifting from skepticism to consideration. The promise of a share in the profits, coupled with the clear vision and confidence exuded by both Silas and Ilara, was compelling. Jed, after a moment of thoughtful silence, gave a slow nod. Well, Silas, Jed said, a rare smile playing on his lips. If you and Mrs. Silas think we can do it, then I reckon we can. I'll be here, and I reckon most of the boys will be too. A collective cheer went up from the ranch hands. The threat of winter and the departure of valuable men had been averted. Instead, a new vision had been forged, a shared dream of prosperity and stability, built on the solid foundation of hard work, mutual respect, and the unexpected partnership between a stoic rancher and the woman he had chosen, not as a joke, but as his equal. The Double Bar Ranch was set to grow, not just in size, but in the strength of its community. The first snows of winter arrived with a fierce intensity, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in a thick, pristine layer of white. The world outside the Double Bar Ranch house transformed into a silent, frozen wonderland. The wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the window panes, but inside, warmth and activity prevailed. The plans for the spring farming venture had galvanized the ranch, providing a shared focus that kept spirits high despite the harsh weather. Ilara found herself immersed in the meticulous planning of the new agricultural enterprise. She spent hours in Silas's study, poring over seed catalogues, calculating costs and drafting projected budgets. The sheer volume of information was daunting, but Ilara approached it with a focused determination. She discovered a natural aptitude for organization and financial management, her earlier struggles with her uncle's manipulative schemes having inadvertently honed her skills. Silas, meanwhile, ensured the ranch itself was well prepared for the winter. He oversaw the distribution of feed to the cattle, ensuring they were healthy and well-nourished. He organized the men for snow removal, keeping the essential pathways clear between the house, the barns, and the bunkhouse. Evenings were spent not just in quiet companionship, but also in strategic discussions about the upcoming farming season. "We need to order the plows and cultivators early," Silas said one evening, tracing a line on a map of the ranch's arable land spread across the oak table. "The manufacturers get swamped by spring, and I want to ensure we get the best quality." "I've been looking at the seed catalogues," Ilara replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We should focus on crops that thrive in this climate. Wheat, certainly, and perhaps some hardy vegetables like potatoes and carrots. They'll provide good sustenance for the ranch hands through the winter, and we can sell the surplus." "Good thinking," Silas nodded, his gaze appreciative. "Your practical approach is invaluable, Ilara." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "It's a different kind of work than I'm used to, managing crops, but with your help, I believe we can make it a success." The simple words of acknowledgement, the shared sense of purpose, were a constant source of strength for Ilara. She was no longer just Silas's wife. She was his partner, contributing meaningfully to the ranch's future. One particularly blustery afternoon, a rare visitor arrived at the ranch. A traveling salesman, a jovial man named Mr. Henderson, with a wagon laden with an assortment of goods. He offered everything from bolts of fabric and household necessities to a few newfangled gadgets that promised to make life easier. Mr. Henderson, accustomed to the rugged independence of the frontier, was initially surprised by Ilara's sharp business acumen. She negotiated prices with him with a shrewdness that impressed even Silas, who watched from the doorway with a quiet, knowing smile. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, ma'am," Mr. Henderson declared, wiping his brow with a checkered handkerchief. "Most women are content to just point at what they need. You understand the value of $1. Ilara simply smiled. She'd learned the hard way how to protect her own interests, and now those skills were serving her well. As Mr. Henderson prepared to depart, he produced a small, intricately carved wooden music box. "A little something for the lady of the house," he said, presenting it to Ilara, "a token of appreciation for your fine business dealings." Ilara accepted the gift with gratitude. The music box was delicate, a far cry from the rough practicality of ranch life. When she wound it up, a soft, melodious tune filled the air, a sweet counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Silas watched her, his expression softening as he observed her delight in the simple melody. "It's lovely, Silas," Ilara said, her eyes shining. "Thank you for this life." Silas walked over to her, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, his voice low, "for being a part of it." As the winter wore on, the planning for the farming venture continued. Silas and Ilara worked tirelessly, their collaboration strengthening their bond with each passing day. They were building more than just a farm. They were building a future together. The harshness of the Wyoming winter, which had once seemed like a formidable adversary, now felt like a necessary period of preparation, a time of quiet growth before the burst of activity that spring would bring. Ilara, once an outcast, had found not just a home, but a purpose and a partner in the heart of the untamed West. The story of the obese daughter, sent as a joke, was rapidly becoming a testament to resilience, unexpected love, and the profound strength found in shared endeavor. The relentless grip of winter began to loosen its icy hold. The snow, though still deep in places, started to recede, revealing the first hesitant shoots of green pushing through the thawing earth. The air, once bitingly cold, now carried the fresh, clean scent of damp soil and new life. A palpable sense of anticipation hummed through the Double Bar Ranch. The extensive planning for the spring farming venture had culminated in a flurry of activity. Silas, energized by the approaching planting season, had overseen the construction of new irrigation ditches, a project that had kept the men occupied throughout the latter part of winter. He'd also secured the necessary equipment, Sturdy plows, a cultivator, and a seed drill, all delivered by Mr. Henderson's well-timed wagon, much to Ilara's organized delight. She had meticulously managed the procurement of seeds, carefully selecting varieties known for their hardiness and yield in the Wyoming climate, and ensuring they were stored in optimal conditions. The ranch hands, their spirits buoyed by the promise of new work and the prospect of a share in the farm's profits, were eager to begin. Jed, as always, was the picture of efficiency, organizing the men into teams, assigning tasks, and ensuring that every tool was in prime working order. "It's a new chapter for the double bar, Silas," Jed remarked one morning, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the newly plowed fields. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd be planting more than just prairie grass and feed." Silas, standing beside him, a rare smile gracing his lips, nodded in agreement. "It's Ilara's vision as much as mine, Jed. She's got a good head for this kind of thing." Ilara, meanwhile, was actively involved in every aspect of the preparation. She visited the fields daily, observing the progress of the plowing, offering suggestions on soil preparation, and ensuring the irrigation channels were functioning correctly. She worked alongside the men when needed, her large frame surprisingly agile as she helped clear debris or carried supplies. Her presence was no longer that of an outsider, but an integral part of the ranch's operations. She had earned their respect not through coercion or dominance, but through hard work, genuine care, and a shared commitment to their collective success. One afternoon, as Ilara was supervising the loading of seed sacks onto a wagon, a rider approached the ranch at a gallop. It was a young man, a rider from a neighboring, smaller ranch, his face etched with urgency. He dismounted quickly. His horse lathered. "Mr. Silas?" the young man panted, approaching Silas, who had been inspecting the newly repaired barn doors. We need help. A fire. It's gotten out of control at the Miller place. Their barn is burning and their haystacks too. They're calling for any hands who can spare a moment." Silas's expression immediately turned grim. Fires on the prairie, especially with the dry winds that often blew, were a constant danger. The Miller ranch was several miles to the east. "How bad is it?" Silas asked, his voice taut. "Real bad, sir," the young man replied, his voice strained. "They've got women and children there. They can't fight it alone." Without hesitation, Silas turned to Jed. "Jed, gather as many men as you can. We'll take our water barrels, wet blankets. Ilara, can you prepare provisions, water, food, anything they might need for an extended stay if necessary?" "Of course, Silas," Ilara replied instantly, her mind already cataloguing what needed to be done. Her usual focus on the farm preparations shifted instantly to the immediate crisis. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a readiness to help. Within minutes, a contingent of ranch hands, including Silas and Jed, were mounted and heading towards the Miller ranch, their wagons laden with water and supplies. Ilara, overseeing the packing of additional provisions, felt a pang of concern for Silas, but also a deep sense of pride in his immediate response. He was not just a rancher. He was a pillar of the community, always ready to lend a hand in times of need. As she packed the last of the water skins, Ilara realized how much had changed. Just a year ago, she would have been terrified by such news, helpless to assist. Now, she was an active participant, contributing in her own way. The seed of her own resilience, planted in difficult soil, was beginning to bloom. The stories of the West were not just about survival. They were about community, about neighbors helping neighbors, and about finding strength not just within oneself, but in the bonds forged with others. The fires at the Miller Ranch were a stark reminder of the dangers of the frontier, but the swift, unified response of the double bar hands was a testament to the enduring spirit of cooperation that thrived, even in the face of adversity. The farming venture, though temporarily on hold, had already fostered a stronger sense of unity, and that unity was now being tested in a more immediate and critical way. The sky over the Double R Ranch had been a bruised purple for hours, the air thick and heavy with an unspoken tension that mirrored the turmoil in Sarah's heart. The wind, once a gentle caress across the plains, now whipped and snarled, tearing at the sturdy timbers of the ranch house. Inside, the flickering lamplight cast long dancing shadows that seemed to animate the fears Sarah had tried so desperately to keep at bay. She stood by the window, her reflection a distorted silhouette against the raging tempest outside. Her gaze was fixed on the winding dirt road that led to town, a road that had brought so much heartache and so much unexpected joy. Tonight, it felt like a path leading to an unknown precipice. The letter lay on the small table beside her, its crisp paper a stark contrast to the rough, calloused hands that had held it. Elias's words, filled with a desperate plea for understanding and a humble admission of his past mistakes, had ignited a flicker of hope, but the gnawing doubt remained. Could she truly trust him, after all the years of silence, the years of believing he'd abandoned her? The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest within the ranch house. Jedediah, his weathered face etched with worry, sat by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames as if searching for answers within their dance. He hadn't spoken much since the letter arrived, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a quiet concern. He knew Elias, had known him longer than Sarah had, and the weight of their shared past and Sarah's uncertain future pressed heavily upon him. "He's coming, ain't he?" Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, barely audible above the rising howl of the wind. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "He said he would, said he had to explain." "Explanations don't always mend what's broken, girl," Jedediah said, his eyes still on the fire. "But sometimes they're the first step." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "And you gotta decide if you're ready to take that step, Sarah. Not for me, not for anyone else. For you." The words hung in the air, a truth Sarah couldn't deny. She had grown so much in the past few months, so much more than she ever thought possible. The ranch, once a symbol of her father's well-intentioned but misguided efforts to shield her, had become her sanctuary, her proving ground. She had learned to ride, to mend fences, to understand the rhythms of the land and the livestock. She had found a strength within herself she never knew existed, a resilience forged in the quiet solitude and the demanding work. But Elias's return, his letter, it threatened to unravel all of it. It brought back the ghost of the girl who had been so afraid, so ashamed, the girl who had believed she was unlovable. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a new feeling, a hesitant curiosity, a yearning to understand the man who had written those words. Suddenly, a sharp crack of thunder shook the house, rattling the windows. A surge of anxiety pulsed through Sarah. The storm wasn't just outside, it was closing in, threatening to consume her. She thought of the townspeople, of the whispers and the stares that had followed her for so long. She thought of the cruel laughter that had echoed in her memory, the laughter that had labeled her the obese daughter, a punchline sent to a harsh reality. Then her thoughts turned to Liam, his steady presence, his unwavering kindness, his quiet strength. He had been a rock for her, a reminder that she was seen, truly seen, for who she was. He had never judged, never mocked. He had simply accepted her, encouraged her, and in doing so had helped her to accept herself. His belief in her had been a beacon in her darkest hours. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by an instantaneous roar of thunder that made the very floor tremble. The wind shrieked like a banshee. Sarah flinched, her hand instinctively going to her chest. This was it. The storm was here, and with it, the arrival she both dreaded and longed for. She took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes meeting Jedediah's. "I'm ready," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm ready for whatever comes." Jedediah nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "That's my girl." He rose, his joints creaking, and moved towards the door. "Let's go meet him together." As Jedediah opened the heavy wooden door, a blast of wind and rain swept into the house, extinguishing one of the lamps and plunging the room into deeper shadow. The storm had indeed broken, and Sarah knew with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that nothing would ever be the same again. The road ahead, shrouded in the fury of the elements, was uncertain, but for the first time Sarah felt ready to face it, not as the girl sent as a joke, but as the woman she had become. The rancher's daughter, who had found her own strength on the unforgiving plains, was about to confront her past, and perhaps her future. The journey from town had been a brutal one. Elias gripped the reins of his horse, his knuckles white as the wind and rain lashed at him with relentless fury. Each gust felt like a physical blow, a test of his resolve. The dark, bruised sky seemed to mirror the turmoil in his soul, a fitting backdrop for the confession he was about to make. He had ridden for days, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders, the words of Sarah's letter a constant echo in his mind. Sent as a joke. The phrase burned him, a stark reminder of his own cruelty, his own misguided attempt to escape a painful reality by inflicting pain on another. He had convinced himself, for so long, that his actions were justified, a desperate measure to protect himself from the overwhelming grief and shame that had consumed him after his wife's death. He had blamed Sarah, blamed her perceived otherness, for his inability to move forward, to find happiness. It was a cowardly excuse, a pathetic deflection, and the older he got, the more he understood the depth of his transgression. Sarah, with her gentle spirit and her quiet resilience, had been the unintended victim of his own brokenness. As he neared the Double R Ranch, the silhouette of the house emerged from the swirling rain, a beacon of warmth and light against the unforgiving darkness. He could see figures silhouetted in the windows, and a knot of anticipation tightened in his chest. Jedediah and Sarah. The thought of facing her, of seeing the pain he had caused reflected in her eyes, made his stomach churn. But he had to. He owed her that much. He owed her the truth. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. The wind nearly tore the reins from his hand. He strode towards the porch, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Jedediah was waiting for him, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Sarah stood a little behind him, her presence a fragile yet powerful force. "Elias," Jedediah said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You made it through the storm." "I did," Elias replied, his voice raspy. He looked at Sarah, and for a moment the words caught in his throat. She was different, stronger. The girl he remembered, the one shrouded in insecurity, was still there, but there was a new light in her eyes, a quiet confidence that belied her size. It wasn't the size that defined her, it was her spirit, and he had nearly crushed it. "Sarah," he began, his voice wavering, I don't know where to start. There's so much I need to say, so much I need to apologize for." He stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "That letter I sent you, it was the truth, every word. I know I hurt you. I know I failed you. When your mother died, I was lost. I was drowning in my own grief, and I lashed out. I took my pain and I made it yours. I sent you here to this ranch, thinking it would be easier for me, easier for everyone. I convinced myself it was for the best, but it was selfish. It was cruel." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she held his gaze. Her own tears, not of sorrow, but of a dawning understanding. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse that radiated from him. It wasn't the cruel mockery she had always imagined. It was the brokenness of a man who had lost his way. "Why now, Elias?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "After all these years?" "Because," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "because I've lived with the guilt for too long. Because I've seen what a remarkable woman you've become, despite my failings. And because I can't stand the thought of you believing you were just a joke. You were never a joke, Sarah. You were always my daughter. And I was a terrible father." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. "This was your mother's. She used to read to you from it. I couldn't bear to look at it for a long time, but I realized it belonged with you. It's filled with her stories, her thoughts. It's a piece of her and a piece of us." He held it out to her. Sarah hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. The leather was soft beneath her fingers, familiar and comforting. She opened it, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting. It was filled with love, with observations about the world, and with words of encouragement for a daughter she had barely known. "I understand," Sarah said, her voice trembling. It hurt. A lot. But I've learned to live with it. I've learned to live here. This ranch, it's become my home. And I'm glad," Elias said, a genuine relief washing over his face. "Jedediah, he's been a good man to you." Jedediah grunted. "Did my best, Elias. She's a strong woman, your daughter." "She is," Elias agreed, looking at Sarah with newfound admiration. "And I'm so sorry I ever doubted that. I'm sorry I ever made you doubt it yourself." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sarah. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to hear it from me. I wanted you to know the truth. And I wanted to tell you, I want to be a part of your life now, if you'll let me." The wind howled, but inside the ranch house a fragile peace began to settle. The storm outside raged on, but the storm within Sarah's heart was beginning to recede, replaced by a quiet understanding, a sense of closure. She looked at Elias, at the man who had been both a source of pain and a distant memory. He was flawed, deeply flawed, but he was also her father. And in his apology, in his vulnerability, she saw not a joke, but a man finally facing his own demons. "It will take time, Elias," she said, her voice steady. "A lot of time, but I'm willing to try." Elias's shoulders sagged with relief. He nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you." The storm, as if sensing the shift in their hearts, began to abate. The fierce wind softened to a strong breeze, and the relentless rain lessened to a steady downpour. The thunder rumbled in the distance, a fading echo of the turmoil that had passed. On the plains of the Double R Ranch, a reckoning had taken place, not with anger or resentment, but with truth and a hesitant hope for reconciliation. The journey ahead for Elias and Sarah would be long and undoubtedly challenging, but the first, most difficult step had been taken under the watchful eye of the storm, a storm that had ultimately cleared the way for a new beginning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a hesitant sun. The air, once thick with the fury of the tempest, now smelled of damp earth and the sweet wild scent of prairie flowers. A vibrant rainbow arched across the sky, a promise of brighter days to come, mirroring the fragile but burgeoning hope that had taken root within the walls of the Double R Ranch. Elias had stayed, not as a claimant to his past authority, but as a guest, a student of the life he had once so carelessly dismissed. He worked alongside Jedediah, his hands, once accustomed to the delicate touch of a lawyer's pen, now rough and calloused from mending fences and tending to the herds. There was a quiet dignity in his labor, a silent penance that spoke louder than any words. He watched Sarah not with the distant, judgmental gaze of the past, but with a growing respect and a profound, rediscovered love. Sarah, in turn, found herself navigating a new landscape of emotions. The raw pain of Elias's past actions had begun to dull, replaced by a complex tapestry of understanding, forgiveness, and a cautious re-establishment of a paternal bond. She discovered facets of Elias she had never known: his sharp intellect, his dry wit, his surprising knowledge of poetry and history, remnants of the man he had been before grief had consumed him. They spent evenings by the fire, Elias reading aloud from his wife's journal, Sarah listening, piecing together the fragments of a shared past, and finding a strange sort of solace in their shared lineage. Jedediah, the stoic guardian of Sarah's newfound independence, observed their evolving relationship with a quiet satisfaction. He had seen Sarah blossom into a woman of strength and resilience, and to see her embrace her father, not out of obligation, but out of genuine growth, was a testament to her indomitable spirit. He continued his role as her mentor, guiding her in the business of the ranch, his gruff exterior softening with each passing day, revealing the deep affection he held for his ward. Liam, too, remained a constant, steady presence. His quiet support, his unwavering belief in Sarah, had been the foundation upon which her self-worth had been built. He understood the complexities of her situation, the delicate dance between her past and her present, and offered his friendship without expectation or pressure. He was the embodiment of the healthy, loving relationship Sarah had always deserved, a stark contrast to the fractured bond with her father. Their shared laughter, their easy companionship, spoke of a future that held the promise of deep connection, a future where Sarah was an equal partner, cherished and respected. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Sarah and Elias stood by the newly built corral, watching a young colt frolic in the pasture, Elias spoke, his voice laced with a gentle melancholy. "Your mother would have loved this, Sarah. She always dreamed of a place like this, a place where life was simple, honest, where you could watch things grow." Sarah smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "She would have loved you too, Elias, the man you are now." Elias's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "And I, my dear daughter, am so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. You took what was given to you, a difficult past, a harsh reality, and you forged something beautiful from it. You showed me what true strength looks like." He reached out, not with the hesitant tremor of a stranger, but with the confident embrace of a father. Sarah, without hesitation, leaned into his arms, a sense of peace settling over her, that was deeper and more profound than she had ever imagined. It wasn't the triumphant conclusion of a fairy tale, but the quiet, enduring strength of a family slowly finding its way back to each other, acknowledging their flaws and embracing the possibility of healing. The ranch, once a symbol of Sarah's isolation, was now a vibrant hub of life and renewed connection. The land, which had tested her mettle, now offered solace and purpose. The cattle grazed peacefully, the fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, and the laughter of Sarah, Elias, and Liam echoed across the wide, open spaces. Sarah stood on the porch of the ranch house, the worn leather journal in her hands. The sun warmed her face, and the scent of the prairie filled her lungs. She was no longer the obese daughter, sent as a joke, a pawn in a man's broken world. She was Sarah, the rancher's daughter, a woman who had faced her deepest fears, embraced her past, and found her own extraordinary strength. The road ahead was still long, but it was no longer shrouded in doubt and despair. It was a road paved with resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring promise of love, a road leading not to an end, but to a new, vibrant beginning, rich with the seeds of a future she had bravely cultivated for herself. The Double R Ranch, once a place of exile, had become her kingdom and she its rightful radiant queen.